Okay, am I on? Yes, I'm on. Okay. Hello, everybody. The time is now 5:30 p.m. on May 20, 2020, and this public meeting of the State Board of Education will come to order. This meeting of the State Board is being held virtually to protect residents' health during this public health emergency. The roll will now be called to determine the presence of a quorum. Mr. Hayworth, please call the roll.
Mr. Gasoi.
Present.
Mr. Jacobson.
Present.
Ms. Wattenberg.
Present.
Dr. O'Leary. Dr. O'Leary.
Present.
Mr. Parker.
Present.
Dr. Sutter.
Present.
Ms. Williams.
Present.
Mr. Batchelor.
Present.
Ms. Macleay.
Present.
Mr. O'Sullivan.
Present.
Ms. Burton. Ms. Burton. Madam President, you have quorum.
Thank you. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. Are there any additional corrections or additions to it? Seeing no changes, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I have an amendment to the teacher retention resolution.
That can come later. That can come later. Can I get a motion to thank you? Second?
Second.
Okay, the motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, opposed? Okay, seeing no opposed, the motion is approved. Members, we have the minutes from our May 6th working session before us. Are there any corrections or additions to them? Okay, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a second?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, the motion being properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any nays? The motion is approved. Okay, with that, we'll get started. My name is Ruth Wattenberg. I'm the Ward 3 representative to the State Board of Ed and the president of the State Board. On behalf of the members of the District of Columbia State Board of Education, I welcome our guests and our viewing public to our Wednesday, May 20th public meeting held virtually due to the coronavirus pandemic and the importance of social distancing. Normally, the State Board holds its regularly scheduled meetings on the third Wednesday of every month, usually at the Old Council Chambers at 441 4th Street Northwest. It seems that we'll be meeting virtually for the near future, but we will keep you informed if and when, as soon as possible, we are able to meet again in person. The video for this meeting will be posted on our YouTube page at DCSBOE, and it will be broadcast on the District Knowledge Network as soon as it's available. Our next official meeting of the State Board is our working session on June 3rd, 2020. That session will also be held virtually. Tonight, the State Board will be considering 4 resolutions, 2 ceremonial resolutions recognizing the role of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in our shared history, and in honor of recently celebrated Teacher Appreciation Week, the importance of teachers and principals across the district. We'll also consider resolutions related to the State Board's work on teacher retention and in response to what the State Board learned at our recent working session about the impact of COVID-19 on our students in special education programs. The board will also hear from 4 experts as part of our continued review and evaluation of the district's school transparency and reporting plan, also known as the STAR framework. Tonight, we'll be focusing our discussions on how we currently measure school quality, the strengths of these measures, concerns that may exist, including whether socioeconomic factors are playing an outsized role in the evaluation, and alternative options. Finally, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the mayor's budget that was released on Monday. The budget increases overall education funding for district schools, even during a public health emergency and a declining budget, and I applaud that effort. Meanwhile, there are still many steps ahead before the budget is enacted. I will be testifying at the State Board's portion of the budget on June 4th. The Council has set up 2 methods for the public to submit testimony. Written testimony can be sent directly to the relevant committee, in our case, the Committee on Education at astrange@dccouncil.us. The public can also submit testimony via voicemail by calling 202-430-5720. We encourage you to submit testimony related to the budget. Now I'll turn to the State Superintendent, Han-So Kang, for any opening statement she has tonight.
Thank you very much, President Wattenberg. It's good to be with board members this evening for your May public meeting. OSSI continues to respond to the challenges that the city faces due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mayor Bowser submitted her fiscal year 2021 budget to the council on May 18th. The FY21 budget responds effectively to the budgetary challenges caused by the pandemic, while also sustaining the progress that we have made as a city. And we look forward to our oversight hearing before the budget oversight hearing before the council on June 4th. This evening, the board will hear from a panel of thought partners on measures of school quality. In preparation for that panel, I would like to provide some background on the status of the DC School Report Card and the STAR framework. After extensive public engagement and partnership with the State Board of Education and its ESSA task force, OSSI presented the STAR framework in our ESSA state plan. In March 2017, this body approved the STAR framework, and the U.S. Department of Education approved the district's ESSA state plan in August of the year. OSSI then produced the STAR framework and the DC School Report Card in 2018 and 2019 based on that approved plan. As I mentioned last month, OSSI has suspended statewide assessments for the 2019-20 school year because of the current ongoing public health situation. Sorry, I just lost my place for a second. Because our STAR rating system depends on the administration of those assessments, there will be no STAR ratings for the 2019-20 school year, though we will be reporting some school data later this year in fulfillment of federal requirements, as well as the ongoing public interest in data and information and transparency. As the board engages in this conversation regarding the implications and the future of the STAR framework, I would like to again point members and staff to the suite of available resources on our website that describe the STAR rating system and the DC School Report Card metrics in detail. OSSI has published a number of resources that should ground this conversation. The DC School Report Card and STAR Framework Technical Guide show how all data is collected, how each metric is calculated, and how the STAR Framework measures overall school performance. OSSI also produced a 2019 STAR Framework brief and appendices which share citywide performance trends for frameworks, student and metrics. These resources, along with downloadable files, provide unprecedented transparency into the STAR framework. All the resources are available again on our OSSI website. I understand that members of the board are anxious to discuss the future of the STAR framework and circumstances related to the COVID pandemic and implications for schools become clearer. OSSI will provide more information on assessments and accountability related issues. Also this evening, the board will consider a ceremonial resolution honoring the impact of teachers and principals in the district. I want to support this resolution, and I'm continually find myself proud and humbled by the hard work that our teachers and school leaders do every day. I'm inspired by the lengths that our DC educators have gone to and continue to go to engage with students and support their learning and well-being during this challenging time for all of us. I'm also glad to see that the board is voting on a ceremonial resolution to recognize Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. As you know, many Americans of Asian background have faced truly disheartening and painful verbal abuse and in some cases even physical attacks around the country due to harmful attempts to falsely scapegoat this community for the COVID-19 pandemic. This resolution is timely and certainly aligns with our DC values of inclusivity and respect. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Superintendent, and thank you for referring us all to the data that you have. And let me just say to everybody listening, the amount of data that has been collected and the ability of all of us to go look at it is indeed incredible. I hear all the time from other states about what a terrific set of resources it is. So I really encourage people as we go through this discussion to look at it, and we will be referring to it as well. Thank you very much. Before I go to public comment, I want to acknowledge Jessica Sutter for a comment, maybe a motion.
Thank you very much, Madam President. John Paul can correct me, but I don't actually think I have to make a motion on this. I think I'm just going to speak for a few moments. I am the chair of the Social Studies Standards Review and Revision Committee on our state board. And as you know, we've been working to hear from the public for the past several months about the need for updates, revisions, and changes to our social studies standards. One of the steps in the process we agreed to as part of that work is to create a standards advisory committee. Members of the public, teachers, parents, principals, students, experts from both universities and other education organizations to come together and help advise state board members on how we should approach the requested revisions and updates to the state standards. We'll work to assemble that advisory group using an application that we're excited to launch tonight. So if you're following us along on social media, you'll soon see information there about the application for our advisory committee, how you can apply. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of pieces of information about this advisory committee. One is that we hope many members of the public who are watching, who care about the social studies standards here in the district, will consider applying. We're looking to get a broad group of stakeholders involved in this process of helping us determine what updates are needed to the standards. Two, we hope that members of the public who are watching and folks who care about social studies will help us share the application with their communities. So if you're a teacher, we hope you're sharing it with your colleagues who are also teachers. If you're a university-based person, we hope you're sharing it with your colleagues who are experts. The application will be live and available tonight. It'll be open for 2 weeks with a deadline of June 12th. It is a relatively short application with a lot of multiple choice options, so we hope that it is not too cumbersome for folks to complete. The state board will then come together, review our applications, and announce the selected members of the committee by, we hope, the end of June. The goal of beginning to have the committee meet in July. Given COVID, we expect that first meeting and perhaps the first several meetings will be virtual. We'll be planning to hold those meetings on the first Tuesday of every month, and we'll be meeting beginning in July, we hope, through the end of 2020, when we'll pass along recommendations for how to revise the standards to our partners at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education. You can find more information in the application, which again, I'll refer you to our Twitter feed and all of the ways you can follow State Board on social media, and we'll be sharing that this evening. Thank you so much, Madam President.
Oh, thank you. Okay, public comment. The State Board welcomes public participation in activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. Your comments will become part of our permanent record. If you're a member of the public and would like to speak at a future public meeting, please contact our staff by email at sboe.dc@dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Due to our switch to virtual meetings, we have not taken live public testimony since February. We announced last week that we would begin to hear it live again tonight. And tonight we have one brave public witness willing to be here on our virtual setup. Laura Fuchs. Ms. Fuchs, if you are ready, you have 3 minutes for your testimony tonight.
All right, thanks. I thought I'd been missing the previous ones. I didn't realize this was the first one. All right, so thank you for allowing this to happen. So there are going to be a lot of people who are going to fight to protect the status quo in the midst of a global pandemic. They're going to continue to insist that equity can only be measured with metrics like test scores and attendance rates. Now more than ever, we need to push back against this false narrative and amend the systems and tools we use to rate schools to best achieve the goals of equity that we all want to achieve. More than ever, we must resist cold, hard metrics that incentivize schools to take shortcuts and only serve those who make them look good in a bid for survival. The mayor's already put language in her FY21 budget proposal that would allow for underutilized building space to be subject to co-location. The history of this in DC is that public schools are often closed in short order and the building is turned over to co-located charter schools, and in the past, determining what sites are underutilized has been based in part on test scores and school ratings. We should resist the urge to find ways to bring back the stars amidst a pandemic. Instead, we should focus on reporting on what is important to stakeholders in all centralized places, or in a centralized place, in a way that incentivizes the LEAs and schools to do what is best for all. We should engage the community like we have in the past to learn what they want to know about the schools and then use the reporting systems we already have in place to collect and share that information. I won't claim to know what is most important to our stakeholders, but I believe that focusing on measuring inputs is a way to make sure that our communities get what is owed to them for our schools. That could be reporting the ratio of devices to students, what online platforms and programs are being utilized for distance learning, the emotional supports that are being provided, special education supports, social distancing procedures and protections, etc. Now's the time to remember those of us working in schools are human beings serving other human beings. We're more than a number and more than a score. We need to truly innovate and look at how we can measure how we treat those human beings instead of the final output. We must go beyond the stars, go beyond test scores, stop treating us like problems that need to be solved, treat us like human beings, and work with students, parents, teachers, staff, and admin in the schools, and stop with the labels. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuchs. Are there any questions to Ms. Fuchs before we move on?
I have one. Laura, you were talking about the status quo, and I hope that everyone who's listening understands that the status quo wasn't working as well as it should. And I'm going to say it again, that we need to think about the new reality, about what life should be like in 2020 and 2021, and to go, when we go finally get back in the buildings, that we need to fix what was broken and build on what we know will work in the future. How do you feel about that?
I agree. I mean, obviously, when this first came around, we fought to try to limit or to lower the amount test scores are used to make a star rating. We also tried to advocate against having a star rating and instead just reporting what the federal requirements ask for, not pitting schools against each other with grades. But I think right now we're really at, everything has been exacerbated. So the problems that we had before are now only becoming more glaringly obvious, and it's even more possible that public schools, neighborhood public schools, will be at the losing end of this. And we've seen it in other districts. We've seen pushes for privatization, which use these kinds of metrics to push their goals. I just worry that, this is a chance, I guess, since we're already going to revisit things anyways, like this is a chance to revisit and try to figure out what will actually achieve equity, not just equality in the form of a test score.
Any other questions, comments? Mr. Batchelor?
I just wanted to say thank you, Laura, for coming and for always being a strong advocate, even in these abnormal times. And obviously, I think, what resonated from your testimony most with me was the fact that you illustrated very well is that we're learning in very new ways and very poignant ways how much schools are the centers of community, and that we've got to really invest in our neighborhood schools in the way we want the community around it to reflect and change as well. And so I appreciate your comments. And obviously, as we begin to recover, I'll be alongside you, as I know many of my colleagues will, to really demand that we get the deep investment that so many of our students have been deprived of for so long, and so many of our schools have been too. So thank you.
Ms. Williams?
Laura, I just wanted to say I appreciate you coming to almost every meeting since I've been on the state board to advocate for Woodson, which is also the only DCPS school in Ward 7. And I just wanted to say, being on the advisory board for Woodson and being in the building often, I see some of the wonderful turnaround that school is making. The only downside is its physical location, right? I mean, the biggest downside is the physical location of the school for people living on the other end of the ward. But I see the outreach now and the new respect for the building and the new principal, and how hard that we're working to try to do some turnaround in the school. But that wouldn't have happened without your advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. I'm told that Emily has a question, is that right? Or a comment?
Yes, President Wattenberg, thank you. It's more of a comment. I too am glad to see Laura. It's kind of helps to complete us, I think. But, you know, as we're thinking about returning, returning is going to be, we don't know what it looks like, obviously, and it's going to take some time to even get a picture of what things are going to look like for students and teachers. And so, I think you are right that this gives us an opportunity to sort of rethink some of the practices we have in place, but also we have to think, how are we going to capture what's happening in this new reality? And so we will definitely need you and other teachers as thought partners in thinking about how do we measure the new reality, right? Like, how do we measure or capture school quality when school looks really different than what we used to know it to be? So just wanted to put that out there that we'll definitely be.
What is school quality during a pandemic, right? What do we want? Do we want to focus on math and English test scores, or do we want to focus on the social emotional well-being of our students? And the fact is that when there are limited buildings and advanced campaigns to get those buildings that are taking a lot of money, that schools are going to act in their best interest for survival. And so if we're going to measure standardized test scores, and that is what schools are going to be hell-bent on trying to achieve. And if instead we want to say, well, actually right now what we care about is the social emotional well-being of our students and making sure that they are safe and can survive this pandemic, and not try to freak them out about getting these test scores right now, then we have to think about, like, what are we measuring then? How are we incentivizing schools to do the right thing for our students, not the right thing for the school building or the adults in the school, trying to survive?
Exactly. That's why we'll be reaching out to you for input. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no more hands, and if somebody has something and I'm not calling on you, throw your hand up, but I think we are finished with that. Okay, thank you very much for your time. And I guess you flip over to YouTube or something, I don't know, but there you go, okay. So now we move on to our special panel on measures of school quality, which we've all been alluding to. The state board, to be clear about this, has what's called approval authority for the STAR framework that's used to rate our schools on a 1 to 5 star basis. The plan is developed and proposed by OSCE, but it's ultimately approved by the state board. So it requires a working relationship on this. The plan, as Superintendent Kang said, was approved in March 2017, and the first set of ratings were issued in December 2018 for the school year 17-18. According to that plan, the ratings were to be issued based on essentially the same criteria for 3 years, ending with the ratings for SY 2019-20, which would have been issued this coming December 2020. Of course, there is no park testing this spring, so there won't be ratings in December. In light of that 3-year time frame, the state board voted last year to undertake a review of the rating system. And we look forward to working with OSCE and to working with the public to try to understand fully how it is working, how it's being affected, and are there ways to improve it. Tonight, we have a terrific set of witnesses who are prepared to talk with us about rating systems, about their views, and about their experience with the district's current system, and I will introduce them in a moment. I want to start by saying this panel and discussion tonight follows a March 30th meeting on the same topic, same broad topic, held recently by the board's research committee. To catch everyone else up on that meeting, I'm going to begin with a quick review of the presentations we heard at that meeting, with a set of slides and video. And I'm really hoping that this is going to work well. It's great information, and hopefully we'll be able to make this work. Okay, we are ready to go to the next slide. Wait a minute. I'm sorry. Okay, first, let me say the research meeting that I'm talking about, we had presentations from Erin Cuny and from Betsy Wolf, who are we're gonna see the summaries of their work. Erin is the founder and principal at Uplift Ed School Services. Prior to that, he was co-founder and CEO of Ingenuity Prep and resident principal of DC Bilingual Public Charter School, and before that, a teacher. Betsy Wolf is an assistant research scientist in the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins. Prior to that, she taught math at Sidwell, in DCPS schools, and at Washington Latin. So with that, let's go. All right, great. So we're now in Erin's presentation. Hold on. What we can see here, what Erin was presenting to our committee, is that the star ratings show a systemic pattern about how we are rating our schools. The vast majority of schools with a low at-risk rate get 4 or 5 stars, and schools with a high at-risk rate are 1 to 3 star schools. And so Erin asks us, do we really believe the idea that the only good education, only good schools are those where there are mainly at-risk students? And he asks, how can we test that hypothesis? So next slide. And here, if you look at the I'm not sure this, we're having a little bit of a mix-up on the slide order here. Let's hear the video on this, and we'll see if we can try to figure out how to make this work.
The next graph here has growth only metric for an at-risk student group. I think this is an even better way to ask the assumption about what's the distribution of educator efficacy. Is this an apples to apples comparison, as opposed to the all student data where we know there's some variability in the student profile across schools. And so in looking at this graph, you can also see again that we have some good and some bad low at risk schools in terms of their efficacy in serving kids. And if we look at the set of high at risk schools on the right, you can see again that we have some schools that are doing a really great job of ensuring our at-risk students are growing and learning, and other schools that are doing a poor job. Ultimately, like what we all should want to know is how effectively is the school serving kids. You know, let's take the example of Ballou. Part of what Ballou is being held accountable for right now is the work that's happening inside of that building. But a lot of what Ballou is being held accountable for is the work of all of the schools that serve kids before they walk through the doors of Ballou. And I think our accountability system entangles those two things. And my suggestion is that we will ultimately be best off if we can disentangle those things.
So the gist here, and I'm sorry guys, my slides are showing something different, so I'm trying. Okay.
Ruth, give me 1 second. Sorry.
Okay, everybody enjoy yourselves, have a drink. We'll try to pull this together.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, give me 1 second then.
All right.
Sorry.
I want to say this is the first time that we've tried to do something like this, to bring the results, a summary from one of our committee meetings to a state board meeting. And I think it's a great idea, and we'll see if it works. And if it does, we'll be able to do it more. And what I also hope is that this can live on our website so people can keep track of what we're doing, not necessarily have to go listen to a full hour-and-a-half committee meeting, but get some gist of it. So we'll see.
Am I on the right slide now, Ruth?
Yes. Can you go to the one just prior? Yeah. So so here's, I don't think we saw this. What we can see here is that the extent to which there is this pattern in the ratings where the schools on the top left, which have a very small number of at-risk students, tend to get these 4 and 5s virtually all the time. And on the other end, at the bottom right, schools with a large number of at-risk students tend to get 1s and 2s all the time. To which, a fact to which Erin says, do we really believe that? Is that really the narrative we agree with? So, and then to go to the next one, what he's trying to show is if you look at growth, not everything that's in the STAR framework, right? But just how much do students grow, you can see that the line is different. And it's still, there's a correlation between at-risk and a number of at-risk students and growth on the test scores, but it's much less. Okay. I don't think there's a slide there. Oh, no, there's a, and we just heard that slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we can go to the next one.
Sorry.
So anyway, so Erin's question is, how do we move forward? And he makes a point that we need to take the time to wrestle with our principles. What is it that we're trying to measure here, and to what end? Otherwise, we're not going to ever have the right metrics conversations. And that's part of the conversation I think we'll have later tonight. He makes the point we do not need to completely dismantle STAR. And I think there's a number of ways to do this. He offers a couple in this presentation. One, he notes if we make some changes to the types of student groups that we're weighting, it will create a more level playing field. So, so I think is there a video there? Yeah.
This video?
Yes, wait, before you start, let me say this. Currently, the STAR rating, as you can see here, it weights the performance of all students well, at 78, at 79%, and various subgroups at lower rates. So what happens is we give the most weight to a category that in effect compares apples to oranges, is how he would say it. Compares the performance of students in a given school where most of the students are at risk with another school where most of the students are not, or maybe a large percentage are ELL or they're from special ed. One example of a way in which the STAR framework could be altered is this. Erin suggests that we could alter these weights so that different student groups are each weighted at 20% or perhaps at a different rate. Thus, schools would be compared in an apples to apples way. How are the at-risk students in this school doing versus the at-risk students in that school, and so on. So let's see the video that he's talking about there.
I just want to share two different alternatives. If we supplanted the all student group, which again is that apples to oranges comparison, if we supplanted that with a not at-risk group, we would essentially create a report card that is almost entirely reflective of apples to apples comparison. It would be a level playing field for schools across the city. The only slight caveat here is that race subgroup, depending on the statistically significant racial populations in your school, that might look a little bit different. But by and large, in the first alternative here, by getting rid of the all students group and creating a not at risk group, it creates a level playing field. And in shifting the weighting, you can see here that we are putting a lot less rating on a student population that we know historically historically has done pretty well, and we're giving more weighting for historically underperforming student populations. The second alternative model that I'll share here has those same student groups, but shifts the weighting even more toward our at-risk students. My belief, as I spoke to earlier, is that our accountability systems drive incentive and behaviors, and in a model in alternative 2, a model that placed significantly more weighting on our most underperforming student populations, you would see a shift of attention and resources citywide towards those particular student groups.
Before moving on to Betsy's presentation, I just want to repeat the last point that Erin made in the clip in case anybody couldn't hear it. Our accountability systems, whatever they are, drive incentives and behaviors. And in a model that places significantly more weight on our most underperforming student populations, he argues we will see a shift in attention and resources citywide towards those particular student groups. So that's one way to think about how we might alter this. So thank you, Erin and Absentia, for coming to our meeting and for helping us put this together. Okay, moving on to Betsy's presentation. I think I introduced her. She's a research scientist at Johns Hopkins. She's also a DCPS teacher. She begins by looking at OSSE's elementary school framework, and she points out that 75% of it is focused on test scores and 20% is on non-test factors, especially attendance. And so she says if we acknowledge that what we choose to measure reflects what we value, does our current framework imply that we value test scores the most, and is that really where we want to be? So that's the question that she's posing here. Next. Okay, you want to, here she's going to argue that our accountability system is measuring family income even more than it's measuring school quality. And she first takes a look at the correlation between proficiency and at-risk students. Okay, play the tape.
Graph is proficiency, which is the metric that's the most highly correlated with percentage. But I broke it down a little bit further. I broke it down into a special education level. So this first cell here is like less than 1% in special ed level 3 or 4, and this is 2 to 5% special ed 3 and 4, and this is 10%, and this is 4%. So as you can see, the higher percentage of at-risk have in school, the lower the proficiency rate gets. What this tells me is that the proficiency rate is picking up family income more than it's picking up school quality. I mean, as Erin said, it's pretty hard to believe that school quality falls on a pretty defined line on student at risk. So it's probably more the fact that your proficiency rate represents what you know in 5th grade. And what you know in 5th grade is affected by all the opportunities you've ever had in your life, your health, and all this other stuff. So it's possible that school quality is in here. It's just so small compared to the other components that when we're using this measure, we accidentally end up picking up family income more than we end up picking up educator effort.
Okay, so again, acknowledging sort of observing something similar to what Erin had, this correlation between the proficiency and the at-risk, and wonders if we may be penalizing the schools for factors beyond their control, since proficiency captures what students know at a certain point in time, which is influenced by everything that's happened long before they entered that school. Okay, next slide. Now, moving forward, she also wants to make the case that we also need to be careful with our growth measurements. So let's take a look at this.
Our growth measures are better in the sense that they're not as correlated with poverty. However, DCs actually still kind of are a little correlated. You see in this cell that it doesn't look like there's any correlation here. So when you look within special education, you feel like there's a pretty clear downward line here. There's a pretty clear downward line here. So that tells me that maybe we need to tweak the MVP because it looks like it's still not assessing growth as fair as it could be.
Okay, so she's looking at one part of our growth measure, and I know that Josh Boots, who will be speaking to us soon, knows a lot about how these growth measures work. She's making the case that at least one part of ours, the MGP, the median growth percentile, may still retain some correlation that we might be able to do without. All right, next and last slide, I think. bringing the conversation full circle, Betsy closed out by reiterating that what we measure reflects what we value. And here she compares the framework that we use in terms of what we weight and what we count to the to what is used by the core districts in California's framework. You can see they're a little different. The core framework has social emotional surveys, school culture, climate surveys, suspension rates, chronic absenteeism, and so on. And the point being, and I don't even think we need to hear the video necessarily, the point being, just as Erin talked about, we can weight the student groups differently, we can also measure different things. And those are sort of two things that we might consider as we go forward. And I think that's a great beginning to our panel. So we can go there. Oh, and that, yeah, whatever. And the last thing that she said, that's fine, was just that whatever we value is what we can put into the framework. Okay, with that, I want to thank Betsy for joining us. And tonight we're joined by I think 3 experts. And let me say, we started out with a number more. 2 different individuals had to pull out because of deaths in the family. And at least one was because of COVID. I don't know about the second, so I just want to send my condolences to the folks who couldn't come, and likewise to everybody in DC who is suffering from this, because it is it's pretty substantial. So we're joined tonight, I think, by 3 experts ultimately. The first is Robert Simmons. He's the Executive Director of Black Educators Initiative at Urban Teachers. It's a $25 million initiative designed to recruit, retain, and support Black educators. Additionally, Robert is an adjunct professorial lecturer at American University in the School of Education and senior equity advisor for Strategic Community Partners. Robert has lectured and delivered workshops for over 100 organizations, including Harvard, Georgetown, the Detroit Public Schools Community District, and the University of Chicago. During his career as an educator, Robert served in senior leadership roles at the See Forever Foundation and Maya Angelou Public Charter Schools here in DC, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, and the DC Public Schools. While at DCPS, Robert focused on improving the academic outcomes for boys of color through the Empowering Males of Color initiative. Next is Erin Roth, who is the Director of Education Research at the Office of the DC Auditor and is responsible for overseeing and leading education-related audits, including an audit of district funds for students considered at risk, an audit of enrollment projections as related to school funding, and is currently overseeing an audit of public education data and data systems in the district. Before joining ODCA, she was senior analyst at the Center for American Progress, an education researcher at the American Institutes for Research, an analyst at the Department of Education, and an associate scientist at the National Center for Education Statistics. Prior to those roles, she was a Head Start and kindergarten teacher in North Carolina. Third is Josh Boots, the founder and executive director of Empower K-12. Prior to starting Empower K-12, Josh served in a variety of education roles in DC over the last 16 years, including teaching 7th grade math in a DC public school, leading the KIPP DC data team as their first ever data director, and contributing as a member of OSSE's assessment and accountability team. Josh is recognized as a leader in DC assessment and data analytics. He serves on multiple school accountability system task forces, leads the EdFuel data professional learning community, and was appointed to the DC State Board of Education ESSA task force. He consults for multiple charter LEAs on their integrated data systems and strategic data-driven plans, and he coaches school and data leaders. He also consulted with My School DC, the district's common lottery system, during its first implementation year, running and auditing the lottery matching algorithm. As you can see, it is a terrific panel with a lot of knowledge. Each of you will have up to 5 minutes for your presentation, then we will move to questions from board members. So we'll start with Mr. Simmons.
Good afternoon, Ruth and board members, community members, colleagues. Can everyone see me, hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I have prepared remarks that I'll read and then take some questions. Many have suggested that the term accountability in education has created a culture whereby the associated data is used as a hammer and not a flashlight. hammers on the heads of teachers, hammers on the heads of communities, hammers on the heads of school leaders, and worse yet, hammers on the heads of families. While my particular position on the usage of accountability as a hammer is reflective of my years as a classroom teacher and researcher who utilized critical race theory as my theoretical framework most often, my views on accountability and ranking schools is also informed by the most important role in my life, father of Black boys in a world that oftentimes questions their sheer humanity. As a parent, I want to ensure that my boys receive the best education possible with the very best teachers in the world has to offer. But more germane to this discussion, I want my boys to attend a school where they will be loved, respected, and treated in ways that allow them to not simply meet the benchmark on a standardized test, but also function in a society that places their lives at risk far too often. When looking back at my time as a tenured professor of urban education and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland, I authored a paper in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy that looked at the experiences of African American male teachers who embraced the role of hip hop in classrooms. Throughout this project, I learned that several of the teachers worked in schools that were deemed low performing by state education agencies and consumer oriented organizations. The calculation of that ranking was based on what seemed to be largely driven by measures that allowed for a quick collection of quantitative data, standardized test scores, and grade level proficiency rates. As a former STEM teacher who loves the utilization of mathematics and environmental science to tackle complex problems associated with racism and racial disparities, who became a qualitative researcher as an academic, I am hesitant to make an assessment of the quality of a school without the utilization of any qualitative methodologies or, in the ideal world, triangulation of multiple sources of data. For example, as someone deeply concerned with the lack of teachers of color in many schools across this country, shouldn't we be including whether or not teachers of color feel a sense of belonging in schools that claim to want teacher diversity? While this is one example, we know from the literature and the research that teachers of color can find themselves in schools that are less than 50% students of color. The LEA or school leadership has diversifying the teaching force as a goal. Student test scores are high, and the school is rated highly by consumer-oriented publications. Yet, these same teachers of color feel marginalized due to racism, or for far too many Black men in teaching, relegated strictly to disciplinary duties. The resulting typical outcome, according to researchers, the teachers of color leave the building and oftentimes the profession. Shouldn't this type of data help to inform how to determine school quality and school rankings, especially if we understand the latest research that indicates the quantitative impact teachers of color have on the academic achievement and high school graduation rates of students of color? Am I suggesting that we toss out the rating of schools? Not necessarily. But what I am suggesting, based on my experience, is that we look at what metrics we use to determine school quality and the desired ranking system. Does my experience as a researcher lead me to believe that we should use proficiency metrics? I am not totally convinced that is the correct single measure of school quality or supported by my knowledge of educational equity. Does my experience as a classroom teacher and a researcher tell me that student growth metrics, along with qualitative methodology, focus groups, and interviews, is ideal? Yes, it does, particularly when it comes to determining the success of classroom instruction. We live in a world where young people of color are marginalized by institutional racism, systemic barriers, and oftentimes overt forms of individual bigotry, hateful speech, and behavior, which means they arrive at schools that are oftentimes existing amidst the same conditions as a result of gentrification, food insecurity, or other problems created as a result of unequal distribution of resources. So I'll stop there and answer a few questions. I wanted to keep my remarks brief, just because, as many of my former students say, I can be long-winded. And I'm happy to contribute to the conversation in any way that I can.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to go down the line, and then we'll do questions and rounds. Thank you. I believe Erin is next. Erin Roth.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Simmons. Thanks to everyone so much for the opportunity to talk about metrics of school quality in the district. While the auditor's office has not studied the DC school report card in depth, we have undertaken audits that are relevant to the overall school report card initiative. Our audits highlight the importance of knowing and using student-level data, understanding student mobility and its implications, and understanding if and how data and reporting impact accountability metrics. Our recent enrollment projections audit found that mid-year mobility is, by design, not well reflected in projections, which subsequently affects school funding. In particular, that audit found that high poverty DCPS schools receive more students mid-year than other schools, highlighting that these schools may not be receiving the resources needed for late incoming students. Mid-year mobility addresses a fundamental part of school accountability: which students are enrolled in which school and which students are schools held accountable for. So it's critical that we think about the implications of mid-year mobility for every school report card metric. I'll discuss one example, the re-enrollment metric. This metric uses audited enrollment data to determine whether students re-enroll in the same school on the official district count day. Re-enrollment rates do not currently take into account students who enroll in the same school after count day, nor do they take into account students who exit that same school after count day. As we know from our audit that some schools are more impacted by mid-year mobility than others, this metric is likely harming some schools more than others. The audit also showed that year-to-year mobility is driven to some extent by housing instability. Schools whose students experience more housing instability will also be adversely affected. Given this knowledge, is the re-enrollment metric measuring what we want it to measure? Our current work also sheds light on two other issues relevant to school report cards. First, schools that have students taking more advanced math tests in 8th grade may be differently impacted by our current report card method of lumping together the scores of more difficult and less difficult 8th grade math tests, specifically Algebra 1 and Math 8. There are three issues raised by this finding. First, it's possible that schools using the more difficult 8th grade math test are penalized. Second, it's possible that schools offer the more difficult course but have students take a less rigorous assessment. Third, the lack of clarity altogether may incentivize schools to not offer access to more advanced courses and assessments. These math tests should be reported separately, and to fully understand equitable access to courses and assessments, we need to collect and report advanced course access and the extent to which assessments are aligned to those courses for all middle schools in the district. Finally, we know that measuring student growth is important. However, like the slides earlier were showing, we also know that one of our major current methods of doing this, median growth percentiles, do continue to be correlated with student poverty. The reason that we don't want an undue influence of poverty in our school accountability metrics is that it makes them less useful. Instead of providing a unique signal about student learning, this correlation means that it's hard to disentangle the student body from what schools are actually contributing for students. We can and should be using growth metrics that are less correlated and do more clearly identify student learning. More specifically, we should report both aggregate student scale scores and growth using those scale scores rather than proficiency rates, growth to proficiency, and MGPs. Thankfully, growth and scale scores is really easy to compute given the data that we receive every year from Pearson, and it is significantly less correlated with family background characteristics. I am generally trying to shed light here on a pattern that speaks to the questions you posed in communication with us around adding more metrics and relying on a summative ranking rather than a dashboard. There is going to be error in many metrics that we calculate. It is possible that this error is not randomly distributed, and in fact, that it adds bias in our school report cards, as I've described. While we must continue to improve collection, reporting, and use so that we minimize this error and potential bias, we should also recognize how hard that can be to do, and that we have to work on these goals transparently, consistently, and continuously. To that end, a summative rating doesn't take into account that underlying data may in fact have error, and it assumes that rankings are really legitimately different from one another when they may not be if we accounted for a range of error. A dashboard, on the other hand, does not determine a single ranking and therefore is not vulnerable to error in the same way. The district should consider error and bias in all of our decisions on how to display information on school quality to the public. Thanks again, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Josh Boots.
Good evening, board. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today. Note that I didn't have time to write down formal remarks, but I did write down a few bullet points I wanted to talk about. In Power K-12, we serve schools using data-driven best practices, both from the technical coaching for continuous improvement purposes. We also do some research and evaluation work. Our most recent report was on the potential impacts of achievement on achievement due to the COVID school closures. My thoughts today are grouped into three different categories. One, just what do I think an accountability? What do I think should be in an accountability system? Some changes that I think might be worthwhile to discuss related to the current STAR framework, and then a couple opportunities for the state board to engage further using your time and research budgets. First, all of my thoughts on accountability system are really informed by my time spent at OSSI, my time spent with schools, but really, most importantly, my time spent engaging with communities prior to the report card as part of the ESSA task force that I was a member of on the state board. I did participate in 7 different focus group, more than 7, 14 different focus groups across 7 different wards prior to the report card, and heard from parents and families about what they value. And that leads me to my first point is I think that our accountability system should reflect the values of our community. And I think we're about 85 to 90% of the way there already. I think we do value achievement. We do value growth. We do value graduation, attendance, chronic absenteeism, or the lack of chronic absenteeism, college and career readiness. Those are things that are already in our framework. We also value the achievement of all of our students. And OSSI does report on students with disabilities, English learners, at-risk students with disabilities. The next thing I think is that accountability tools should set high expectations for all. That's a lot of research shows that when we hold adults and students to high expectations, they can meet them. We have schools that have closed the achievement gap. KIPP Promise is a majority, the Ward 7 school with majority at-risk students whose achievement rates are higher than some of our Ward 3 elementary school white students. This work is possible, and I know that our parents that I met in Wards 5, 7, and 8 also have high expectations for their students. They want them to achieve as highly as the students in more affluent parts of our city. The accountability system should, one, be comprehensive, but also afford the public the opportunity to draw clear conclusions about how schools are doing. What I heard from parents when we gave them the PMF report card and the DCPS report scorecard from days past is that they really valued the PMF having clear visuals that go along with the metrics, but also a summative score that helped them identify and put all of those things together. They trusted the people who made them to be reflective of the values that they had as the community, which is why I think that there's still potential for us to improve what we're at right now. And then lastly, we at Power K-12 really believe that there is data for accountability and data for improvement. And even within the accountability, that there's data for ratings and data for reporting. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but a lot of that is around the construct validity of the tools that we use. And that really there's a lot of research about when you move data from the zone of use for improvement to use for accountability, that the construct changes, and the way that schools approach their improvement changes when you move things from improvement to accountability. The things that I think that we can do right now or in the near future related to the STAR framework are split the all students group into at-risk and not at-risk, giving more weight to at-risk. I believe that that is a reflection of the values of our community, that we do care about closing achievement gaps here in the District of Columbia, especially for at-risk students. So weighting at risk more in our final score would make sense. I also believe that there should be a best of growth or achievement measure. For schools that take in new students that are lower achieving, they should be focused on the growth of those students. For those who have high achievement, I don't know that like any more growth, like 50, like an MGP of 50 is good enough. And so like more like focus on continue to maintain that achievement and don't necessarily worry about your growth numbers. I also think there should be addressing previous comments about mobility, two new student groups, one that addresses mobility. We have seen at Empire K-12 with many of our different schools that when you look at the performance of students that have stayed at the same school for 3 or more years, their improvement usually changes. There's also a lot of research that says when students move from school to school, it doesn't matter whether they're high income, low income, Black, white, Hispanic. When they move to another school, it's hard and their growth and achievement goes down. So to address that, adding in a new student group, but we also need to be really cognizant of those new students. And so having 2 student groups, one of students that a school has served 3 or more years and another group of just the new students would really help us tease apart how are the performance and growth different for those student groups. And then a couple of recommendations that I think that the board can do moving forward is really engaging in more research around school environment surveys, making sure that we can identify like student, parent, family, teacher surveys that are reflective of the classroom environments that we care about, that we know that are necessary to get the great growth and achievement, to find tools that are of the highest validity and reliability that we could put on a report card. Also, I think there's an opportunity, given that distance learning will be a future of schools potentially next year and potentially indefinitely. How do we define engagement, right? And attendance. Like we won't have in-person attendance that's the same, but we might have engagement. How can we define engagement and define engagement in a way that has high expectations of what it is like to accomplish stuff when you're not physically in school? And again, thank you for the opportunity. Oh, wait, shoot, I forgot. And the third thing about career measures, we have a lot of measures that are related to college, but not necessarily as many measures related to career skills that for high school.
Thank you very much. So we are going to begin with one round of questions at 3 minutes, and I'm going to let our Executive Director, John Paul Hayworth, advise me either publicly or via chat. I think because we have the smaller group, I think we can do a second round also of 3 minutes. So that's sort of what we'll anticipate. So do people have hands up, or John Paul, do you know who are you?
Yes, Dr. Gasoi.
First of all, excuse me. First of all, thank you all for coming tonight and for advising us. I found this really interesting and useful. I have questions for all 3 of you, but I will start with Dr. Simmons. Thank you for your comments. And I just want to say that it's very appropriate for us. We definitely are looking to frame our recommendations in terms of equity. And so my question is, do you know of good models or practices that you've seen that, for instance, you brought up this idea of including retention of teachers of color or a sense of belonging. Is that something you have seen, or are there other practices like that you would recommend?
So in the research community, generally speaking, most researchers and academics would say that it's really too early to tell whether like the school rating process actually makes a measurable difference. Like there's just not enough proof points because not enough places are doing it with the same tools, the same measures, and things like that. So there's that piece, right? And there's a bunch of different reports that I can certainly send that talk about this and the need for more research in this space, and the need for folks to not get stuck with, which to the credit of OSSI and the district, not get stuck with like, this is the answer, but have a willingness to pull it apart. The sense of belonging with teachers of color, I think that, it requires the intersection with researchers who don't sit in a school evaluation space. And I think that's where, for me, I would encourage the board and others to really pull in folks from African American studies who study the history of this. Because one of the things that we know is that, we need to stop using the term at risk, which is a whole other conversation, because what we're talking about are Black children in DC, right? And so read Ivy Tolson's work to talk about that, but I'll leave that there. But the point I'm getting at is that we have to bring in other people who look like the kids that we serve, academics like Travis Bristol, people of color who have kids in school, who are doing this work. And in DC, we have Cheryl Holcomb McCoy, who's the dean of the College of Ed, or School of Ed at American. Ivy Tolson is right here. The folks at Howard are here. So there are people who are doing this, because part of the bias of these systems and of data and research is we bring our whole selves to the work. And if there's just a bunch of white people sitting around making these decisions, I'm not convinced that that works. And the last thing that I'll say is that just because a school has a high star rating doesn't mean that Black children, in my experience and in the research, leave that school whole. All you have to do is look at the research of how Black students perform at elite prep schools. Go watch the documentary Prep School Negro. So we have to be careful when we start to say, well, this school is great. And yes, students have high performance and achievement, but do they leave as whole people who understand that they exist in a world that's framed by white supremacy and racism? If they do not, then I would question whether we're actually educating people, young folks in DC and other urban communities. Are we just putting them in school, which is open the book, turn to page 35, take the test, and then we demonstrate that they're somehow learned something. And I would encourage you to check out David Stovall, who's at University of Illinois, Chicago. He does ed policy and African American studies work. And he really talks a lot about the difference between school and education.
Thank you very much. The representative's time has expired. Mr. Parker.
Thank you. I was totally not expecting it to come to me that fast. I appreciate it, Josh, you mentioning the proof points that we have in the city. While I believe the argument for emphasizing growth, it resonates. The challenge that I have is that how does that create a system where we are acknowledging and therefore accepting separate but equal? And so this is similar to my colleague's question, but can not just Josh, but any of you speak to how you might better balance proficiency versus growth in our current evaluation system?
Right now, they're weighted equally. And I would say, it would be best to probably have a scientific poll of parents and stakeholders as to how they might value those two things. But from my perspective of being in focus groups, that parents roughly value both of them roughly equally.
Can I change the question? Josh, I know in Power 12, you have your bold performance schools. Can you talk about how that you evaluate those schools and how that is similar or different to how the state board evaluates schools?
Yes, our bold performance schools are based off of achievement, but achievement above expectations. And those expectations are looking at schools with similar demographics and how well are they achieving compared to schools with similar demographics. And so after controlling for demographics, if you are achieving if your achievement rates are at least 10 percentage points higher than similar schools, that would be pulled performance goals. And I know that some states do use a similar schools methodology in terms of their ESSA accountability plans, and that's something that I'm pretty sure that OSSI could also pursue. Is like on the report card is how are you doing overall, and then how are you doing against similar schools or compared to similar schools?
Thank you. And I'm going to just use the rest of my time. Erin and Robert, if you could just weigh in on that question, like how do we ensure we don't have a system where we're expecting different from a child that grows up in Ward 5 or 8 versus a child that grows up in Ward 3 or 2? And how we evaluate our schools.
Dr. Simmons, do you want to go first?
Go for it, Erin.
Thank you. That is a great question, and one that we should continue to talk about, and to Josh's point, continue to talk about with parents, with families, with educators. I think from a data perspective, what I would offer is that if we really value individual students' trajectories, we need to know them really well. We need to be looking at individual student scale scores over time. And this is going back to just standardized tests. And yes, there are a whole host of issues there that Dr. Simmons articulated really well. But we aren't using the data that we do have to its fullest extent. Proficiency rates have a host of problems with them. Our MGPs are still correlated with student poverty. We need to really value the data that we do have and connect student scores over time in across subjects, across schools, and really know where our kids are. Once we know where they are, we can absolutely still present them with grade level content and the supports they need to access that content. But how do we do that if we aren't properly assessing where they are right now?
Thank you. The representative's time has expired. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Drew, for your testimony. And I just had a point that I felt resonated with me. Dr. Simmons, you brought it up a few minutes ago. We were talking about education and what's important, what students, particularly Black kids, take away from school. And it reminded me of my favorite teacher last year, Mr. Denny, my honors language English teacher. He was a Black male teacher, and he was probably one of my best. And one of the things he really hammered home and that really stuck with me was what is like the real purpose of education. And as students, we need to, or in his mind, we read a bunch of texts like from Dr. King, Thoreau, and basically we kind of, I came to the conclusion that pretty much the real purpose of education was to critically examine the society in which we're living and really decipher what's true, what's fake, what's propaganda. And I'm working with Representative Dr. Sutter from Ward 6 on a resolution about retaining and getting African-American teachers to teach in schools. And we had some ideas about ways that could best be implemented of attracting African-American teachers, because we know of the positive impacts they can have on communities, especially African-American students. And I just had a question of what do you think, or from your experience or maybe from studies you've seen, that like some of the ways that we could attract Black teachers, especially Black male teachers, to come and teach in really all levels of schooling, elementary, middle, and high school?
I can hop in. I think that one, we oftentimes mistakenly believe that it's about money for Black educators, and the financial implications of getting a teaching certificate and a master's degree are important. But we also know that historically many Black teachers go into education because of the justice conditions that they want to change and improve. But that also means that we have to critique and do an analysis, Alex, of the conditions in which we place Black teachers in the District of Columbia. For example, disproportionately, Black school leaders are placed in schools in Ward 7 and Ward 8. not in other parts of the city, which often means they have some different challenges than others. And furthermore, that means in that case, they're more inclined to leave. So we have to ask ourselves, where are we placing Black teachers? Because that also makes a difference. Other pieces that we have to consider, what are the types of partnerships we're building with HBCUs? HBCUs provide 40 to 50% of the Black educators, or are we looking for the person with a poli-sci degree from Harvard as opposed to the person with a psych degree from Howard? We have to ask ourselves that, right? And like really dig in to that. Where are we looking at for Black male teachers? The last piece is a quarter of the teachers, aides, and paraprofessionals who are in the District of Columbia have a college degree and are largely Black and from the District of Columbia. What is the pathway and pipeline for them into the teaching profession as opposed to going out to find those who may not have familiarity with the district? So there are pathways, there are pipelines, programs that exist, but there are other ways that this can happen. And folks are actively trying to wrestle with that particular question. So Alex, you should become a teacher, brother, and let's saddle up together and let's do this, right? Like, I'm with you. So you tell me that's what you want to do. I will work with you to make sure that happens and make sure that either through Urban Teachers or whatever you want to do, Urban Teachers is one vessel. I will make sure that we help you find money. Zach Parker will help and all of those things. And everybody on this call will help you do it. But it also starts with young people like you actually going and saying like DCPS, PCSB, we do career fairs and we invite business people, entrepreneurs, engineers. We aren't inviting teachers. I'm confused. I'll get off my soapbox, Alex, but you can send me an email, text message, because my son had his first teacher, Black teacher in second grade, and it changed his life. Miss Chupp, she moved to Dallas, unfortunately, because she retired, but she's not a Cowboy fan, so that's good.
Thank you. The representative's time has expired. I will say, as a point of personal privilege for the executive director, for our student advisory committee, I think I've mentioned at least 3 or 4 times that every one of those people in that room should think about becoming teachers. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. And Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for all of that. We all agree that Alex, if he doesn't run for president, should be a teacher. So maybe he can be teacher first and run for president afterwards. I had a question for you about qualitative metrics. So one thing our committee is considering, this research committee, is this question of what is school quality and how do we define it as a district? So I appreciate that your testimony offered some really good tangible points on that. I was a teacher at KIPP back when KIPP still did school, independent school reviews using the British models. They actually brought over British folks to come and do our school inspection model. Besides the school inspection, are there other qualitative metrics you would encourage us to learn more about and consider as we think about school quality from a qualitative perspective?
So I think that one of the things I've always been a fan of in the qualitative space is doing a focus group or interviews with young people, adults, whatever, when they enter into a space, right? So if you want to know how a student at, I don't know, KIPP in whatever part of the city is doing, ask them at the very beginning of their time. And then when they exit KIPP, whether it's they're asked to leave, whatever the reason is, graduation, whatever it is, ask them another set of questions. And that will tell you, because for those that have been teachers, kids are honest. They have no filter. None. They'll tell you this school sucked because of X. This school was great because of Y. And part of what I would say is that qualitative research is much more time consuming. It costs more money. It can be a little slower because you got to find people to participate and things like that. So that's one piece, is kind of this entry exit type of data collection, because then you can map backwards and things like that. And the last piece that I have found works is actually borrowed from what has been done around Black students who transition from an urban high school that's all Black to an HBCU, and then typically into a professional school that's at a PWI. one of the things that folks look at is and ask them is, what are the things that make you whole? Not what are the things that have prepared you for law school, but what are the things that make you whole as a person? So in other words, what are the things that make Josh Boots whole amidst the COVID-19? Because I'm not talking about technology. I'm not talking about does he have access to DoorDash, but is it that he misses like that human interaction where he can actually see someone or whatever that thing is, right? And so it's much different than like the technical things that we would look at, but it's much more around the adaptive things, because then you can provide the adaptive supports that will help young people matriculate through the school. But I also know that in one of the things that I sent you, the articles, the studies, of the 50 states, no one, generally speaking, uses qualitative data to do this type of work, right? And in large part, at least from my conversations with folks in the academic community, it's because people think it will take time and it costs money to do, right? It costs a lot of money because then you have to have someone go into the community. You have to have these focus groups. You have to have time. Whereas quantitative research, it's faster because you just send out a survey, you figure out what your return rate should be, blah, 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 and poof, voila, you have this data set. And again, I'm oversimplifying quantitative data collection, right? But the point I'm getting at is that the qualitative work takes a little bit more time, and it does make me nervous to actually try and do it because I've never seen it done in this format, in this manner. And even in this data that I sent, none of them actually use quantitative data or qualitative data in any state in America to figure this out, at least from what I can tell in the report and the folks I've talked to. So if folks do, I would like to know where they're doing it and how they do it. So
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Macleay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for your testimony tonight. I really enjoyed listening to it. Especially Josh, my questions will be directed to you tonight because I truly love your 3 ideas of these further metrics that you had on defining engagement, having high expectations, and career measures. I don't think this board spends nearly enough time making sure our students are ready for career success out of our graduation, not just college success. And I have stressed over the past 3 years really trying to spend more time on CTE. When you talk about these 3 measures, I would love to hear some of your further in-depth if you could expand a little bit more on some of your ideas, maybe defining engagement, what that would look like for you, and or high expectations. I know that would be different going from school to school, depending on that student's and that school's what they define as high expectations. But last and not least, career measures. The schools on their report card right now can put that information on, but how would you like to see on a report card how it would be more reflective?
Taking those in reverse order, in terms of the career stuff, I think that one, we need to identify for the different career certification and credentials that are national, the national different sorts of organizations that have these assessments and credentials related to their field. We need to identify that universe, make sure that the assessments themselves are valid and reliable enough to be considered as this is a valid credential, it's used. And so being what percentage of our students either have a SAT score that is X high and they're college ready, or have a career credential by the time they leave high school in their field of choice. So that could be a measure. Then in terms of the high expectations, with the schools that we work with, a lot of that relates with first the social emotional co-academic aspects, like making sure that students have the right self-management skills or the right mindsets to get to the work that they need to do. A lot of that is doing their own sorts of like interval assessments of students, like how does a student in the next 2 weeks show me that they've improved their self-management skills? Those are the kinds of data points for improvement that we use, because we know that joyful environments with kids that are ability to self-manage and have growth mindset and achieve their goals are necessary to get the achievement that we want. In terms of engagement, right now we're working with a lot of schools on what that looks like. That is including like getting data from their learning management system from Canvas, really trying to identify but right now it's a lot of fluid motion. This will probably take a year to just get to the definition of, but like, is it attending a Zoom meeting synchronously, viewing YouTube videos asynchronously, doing X number of assignments in your, but like also codifying, like we at the one of the schools that we work with noticed that like the math teacher and the reading teacher and the science teacher, like were giving different lengths of assignments per day. But when they all sort of narrowed in and did 30-minute assignments each day themselves, like they actually got higher participation. So like when they got into that alignment of like, everyone's going to give a 30-minute sort of like, your expectation of the students can get it done in 30 minutes sort of work, they got more work done. So it's that sort of like engagement pieces, like synchronous, asynchronous, paper packets, learning management systems, like being on Read 180 versus Khan Academy, like getting that sort of engagement. It would be a process. And then also this school environment surveys like Panorama or the 5E Essentials that Chicago uses is for families, students. Like these are sort of validated tools that we could be using here in reporting.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of these ideas. As we all know, student and family engagement really will help lead to successful schools, student success and school success in the long run. And these days, are having more career measures, it can oftentimes be more cost effective right out of the gate. And these students can really hone in when and if they do decide to go to college on having a degree in using it most effectively for the career path that they want to pursue. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you to all of the panelists tonight.
Thank you. Members, I don't see any additional hands. Sorry, Marcus and Fraser now, and Ruth. Okay. Go ahead. Fraser.
Who is it, me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have a question for all of you. We are going to be, whatever happens when school starts, everyone is going to be behind. And it's going to take months before students are comfortable in the grade that they're going to be in. What is your advice for the systems to be able to deal with all of the things that have happened in the last 2 months and all that's going to happen over the summertime? And once the schools open up in whatever form they're going to open up, how do we assess? I mean, I think that the rating system should be just sort of taken out of the whole conversation for next year. But how do we get students up to speed? That's my question.
That's an easy one to solve, Fraser. Thanks for asking it. The things that we've been talking about with our schools are really three things. One is doing some baseline assessments, but that's not just academic assessment. It's using a tool like Renaissance Star NWA Map that is computer adaptive, that will be like how far below grade level might they have regressed or not progressed to, but also bringing them in again as per guidance with CDC guidance and whatever's, but bringing them in individually, at least, and in small groups, at least a couple times before the real school starts, to re-engage them in like re-engaging them with their peers, re-engaging them with adults, especially the younger kids, to be like, this is again how we're going to do school. It will probably be some in person, some not in person. And so like to really re-engage with that social emotional aspect and the mental health that is like, we need to assess their mental health ASAP. I know that a lot of school leaders are already thinking about that. In terms of other things that we are working on, a blog post of potentially like the case for everyone being ungraded for a year, right? That we will ability group students depending on where they fall, but work with that student to be like, where do you want to be in a year from now? You were in second grade last year, you want to be in fourth grade next year. So by the end of this year in June, I need you to be able to demonstrate your abilities to do these 5, 10 things. And we are going to get you there. We are going to start you out in an ability group that is with your peers, because like I can't imagine a teacher trying to differentiate an instruction across 2 grade levels at a time, where if they just have it very more narrow, they can differentiate it to appeal to that student, to really get them engaged, to excite them, to make them interested in the content, to spend their time there, than they're to spend their time differentiating one lesson across 2 or multiple grade levels at a time. But we would also have to be cognizant of like not letting those ability groups fall into the previous pitfalls of ability grouping, where we don't have high expectations of the students and we aren't moving them up to different ability groups when they're ready.
Dr. Williams, Dr. Simmons, I mean.
So one of the things that I have suggested, I was just on a call with some folks from Detroit to kind of think this through for the schools there, and I actually think that waiting until the fall is probably a mistake. But using summer, because you already have summer learning loss already taking place just in the natural structure of our school calendar. So I think that leveraging summer youth employment dollars in cities to help do some of this was my recommendation in Detroit, whereby you have young people who, and again, we know the research on folks learning while teaching, and who are the young people that we believe in our community who could teach others. And not to get too political, but I think that there's a lot we could learn from the literacy structure in Cuba, right? And so the structure of the Cuban literacy work is where young people actually teach younger people how to read. And I think there is a need to leverage already existing dollars and programs. My apologies, I have a 3-year-old yelling for pizza in the background or something. But John, go see what your brother wants. Sorry, I got to put 9-year-old to work too. But I think that figuring out how to leverage already existing programs and dollars to have young people teach each other how to do whatever thing that we're talking about, whether we're talking about computer literacy, whether we're talking about reading, whatever it is, and we can build a freedom school model. And that gets to Alex's point around building this new generation of teachers, because they will actually get a sense of what it's like to be a teacher. So I think that Sharif El-Mekki and his work up in Philadelphia has a great model to think about as we re-enter whatever schooling looks like in 2020 or whatever. I don't even know what the date is anymore, but fall 2020. So I think that there are models that we can use, but I think leveraging dollars that already exist and just reallocating them for a different purpose. And again, you can find folks who can teach this. And again, that helps build the pipeline of folks who are interested in becoming educators and get folks interested. So I think there's a way to do multiple things at this point and not have a doom and gloom because it's going to be challenging for sure. But, the last thing I'll say is that in the same conversation, I encourage folks to look at what Black teachers specifically did to support kids immediately after Hurricane Katrina, right? Like if we want to understand what it takes, go talk to them. And happy, I have to dust off my dissertation, but one of the folks that I talked to in my dissertation actually was a teacher in New Orleans and left And she has a fascinating story about educating, young people post Katrina, leading up to the reopening of schools in the city. So I think that there are lessons that we can learn from that along the way.
I think that just to, I know I don't have any more time, but the thing about it is this is a unique opportunity for education in this city because they can change the rules. They can decide that because every student can learn. And so what we have to do is we have to push the politicians and push the people in power to make sure that we don't go back. We don't go to, there's no new normal. That's a very negative kind of a way to look at it. We want to make sure that the future of education in DC does have equity. And that's what everybody ought to be working on. And I appreciate what you said about the summertime, all right? Because there's no reason why we can't open up the schools in the summertime the same way they're going to look in the fall, even if they're spread out or whatever.
Thank you, Dr. O'Leary. Hi, Michael. Mr. Batchelor.
Thanks, Mr. Hayworth.
Get ready to go to bed.
Hey, Michael. So my question is about accountability and student mobility, and I know it was touched on a little bit, and this is for anyone on the panel, but my question is, when it comes to school accountability, where do we really split the difference, right? I think it was alluded to earlier that there are a lot of factors that impact student mobility that are beyond the school control. But as the ward A representative on the board, I know that there are certain policies and practices and cultures that also drive families away from school buildings. And on top of that, right, in some ways, we have to hold schools accountable for the students they don't serve just as much as the students they do. And so my general question is, when it comes to accountability and judging school quality in relation to mobility, where do we split the difference? And thank you all for joining us tonight.
I guess I'll start first. One, there is the re-enrollment metric. I would also say that there are some of the business rules in terms of students who, the achievement and growth for students who do come in mid-year is not counted towards accountability. It's not part, there's business rules that pull them out. But like I said before, there should be, I think, 2 new student groups. The student group that is students that you've served 3 or more years, you've had the time to move, to grow them, to get them to where they need to be. How are you doing with those students? But then also knowing that there is a lot of mobility and that new students specifically need a lot of that social emotional help in integration into the classroom. And then to really be how are we doing with our new students? I think that if we reported how are our new students doing and how are our students that have been at the same school for 3 or more years doing, we will also see very interesting gaps in outcomes that we probably need to have tough conversations about.
Marcus, I will add that I think that Josh is spot on, but I also think there has to be another conversation about resources because the money doesn't follow kids. And so I know for a fact that this is actually part of, quote unquote, the chess game that schools play, right? So you get money in the door for said students. Said student, won't help you get 100 stars. Said student all of a sudden comes off of your rolls and ends up at another school. And that other school doesn't get additional per pupil outlet funding to support the needs of that student. So it puts you in a bind as a school because you can't say no, but at the same time, what are the additional dollars that you need to provide? Maybe you need a new section of that because you've now reached whatever limit you've established in your LEA, and now all of a sudden you don't have it. So I think that, Mark, I think it's important to do the things that Josh is describing, but I also think that money also has to follow, and whatever the policy is that's governing that and whoever controls that policy, I think it's really important because I have seen firsthand what that does. And I know for a fact that a place like Maya, kids show up after money has been received, and like we're just kind of stuck. Like there's no, like, what are we supposed to do, right? And some of the kids have needs that require additional resources and funding, but yet said school gets 5 stars. That let them go. They have the additional dollars. Said school that accepts them may not get 5 stars because this student has entered, and it increases the lift that you have to support that young person and their family. So I think that there's a deeper conversation that needs to be had there, because I know for a fact school leaders talk about this all the time.
I agree with that. We testified in front of council about adding a mid-year entry weight to the funding formula, because we need to be encouraging more charter schools and all schools to be taking more of the students that arrive to the state mid-year. So reduce the burden on our
Yeah, that's very important. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I think Erin's dropping something too, but thank you all.
Thank you. Ms. Williams.
I'd like to thank both you, Josh and Mr. Simmons, for coming out today. It's been very informative. First, I just have a statement, and I'd like one of or the other of you to verify. Data can be tilted towards the preference of the data taker. Is that not correct? And how do we know if the data that we're not necessarily from you two today, but I'm saying in general, because that we are a data collecting agency and we're trying to do better at that. How do we know that that's the best direction to go? And secondly, when school does finally open next year, or whenever it opens, hopefully soon, could you all speak to how you feel it's best to integrate the children back into the classroom? Should they go back to their old teacher and old friends so that they feel some security, or should they be moved forward to the next step?
also really easy questions to answer, Karen. Thanks. In terms of yes, data, that's why we need to be really clear about business rules. And we know that there's been a lot of really tough discussions about business rules that go behind every data point that is there are 180 different pieces of data that go into a star rating and so there's a lot of business rules that cover each one of those 180 data points. And I know that OSSI makes those publicly available, but we try to be fair and accurate. They have a OSSI has a task force that includes DCPS and public charter school students, and then makes those publicly available before approving them. And the PCSB does the same thing for their PMF. So I think that process we need to continue. And in terms of next year, what our recommendation has been to schools is to at least, again, with this 2-week reorientation to school, is to have those students meet with their current teacher, but then also be mindful of the transition to potentially their next teacher, as we will have some teachers coming and going. We also think, and we've reported that some of our bold schools use strategic teacher looping, when the teacher has great connections with those students and those families and has shown results in terms of growth of those students, and is willing to accept the ability of teaching them next year's content as well. When there's that sort of confidence in the teacher's ability to teach the new content and has the skills, that looping can be a solution, but it's not a solution for every teacher and every student.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo. There's a lot of great research on looping, and to the extent it makes sense for schools and they're able to do that in some way. It doesn't have to be in a traditional way, but some way to maintain that connection. Particularly elementary school students learn more when they have that strong relationship. And to reiterate something that I mentioned earlier, when we use all of these these aggregate data that we're using now that are publicly available, which is great that they are publicly available. It's just not the same as using student level data. We are not valuing and leveraging the data that we have in the district yet. So you can really know a lot better where your kids are entering if you look at them if you look at their scores longitudinally over time. We could know, better which students to be targeting for extra resources over the summer if you know exactly how absenteeism, for example, has played into their growth over time across their entire school trajectory within DC public schools. So these are things that you just can't do sufficiently with aggregate data, and definitely not with proficiency rates.
I agree with that. And I do think a lot of schools are using that student level data to do that kind of analysis already. Erin, happy to talk to you offline.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wattenberg.
Thank you. I have one question for each of you, so hopefully I'll get through them all. And I'm going to go in the order in which you presented. So I'm going to start with Dr. Simmons. You started to talk about, I think, or in terms of the rating as we have it, about the effect that it has on Black teacher recruitment and retention. I wonder if you could say more on that. But you have to turn on your mic.
Yeah, sorry. So all of this goes together, right? And one of the things that my entire dissertation was on Black teacher recruitment. I spent my whole career in this space. And one of the things that I've grown frustrated with is that there's a disconnect between Black teacher recruitment, Black teacher retention, and all other parts of the education system, right? So if you say we want to recruit Black teachers, but yet you put them, generally speaking, in schools that are really difficult to staff. And this isn't a DC thing. This happens in Detroit. It happens in Baltimore. You see the back door of the profession, not just the school, open, right? And people leave. So as we think about this measure of like school quality, we also need to ask ourselves, in these schools, what percentage of the educators are also Black? And which percentage of them started their career there and have been there for 3 to 5 years? Because we know, as David Stovall says at UIC, if you can get Black teachers to last through years 3 through 5, they're much more likely to make it through years 8 through 12 and actually stay in the profession in some other capacity. The second piece that's really important is that the city and just education in general needs to decide, do we want career educators or not? Like, because that determines who you recruit into schools, right? Do we want people to stay, or are we okay with people who leave after a few years? And it's not to suggest that people shouldn't leave the classroom. It's only to say that if you look at the research on sociology and the sociology of relationships, and you think about like parents in incarceration and their kids, right? When you enter, and I can speak from my own personal experience of my father being in and out of my life because of his incarceration, that when you enter a kid's life and you build that relationship and then you're gone, if this happens over and over and over again, students start to lose trust, not just in adults, but also the system that's designed to care for them. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we, to the point around this looping, how do we get Black educators and educators of color in the district to stay in schools with the same kids for longer periods of time? And are we committed to doing that? And if we are, then we have decisions to make about how we recruit and retain educators in our schools. And again, certainly, I think there are ways to do it. I would love to see us collaborate on bringing Travis Bristol as an example. Vanessa Siddle-Walker has a great book out about the history of Black educators. And Ruth, the last thing I'll say is that Black educators were the backbone of the civil rights movement, of the Black Panther Party. Like, there are all of these justice movements. So I always ask folks, are you prepared for what it means to have more Black teachers in your school, which may mean that they may push back on your hyper accountability and hyper standardization, because I want to use hip hop to teach young people about literacy, but that may not fit in what you consider to be the standard curriculum. So we have to ask ourselves these multiplicity of questions. But I'm happy to talk offline about it and share more information about the work that we're doing at Urban Teachers. TNTP is doubling down on increasing teacher diversity. So there are a bunch of organizations nationally that are working on this. Cities are working on it, would highlight the work of Oakland and in DCPS. Shout out to my former colleagues in DCPS. DCPS, with focused efforts in the boys and men of color space, increased the percentage of Black male teachers from 2% to 14%. So there's proof that it actually works, but you have to have somebody who's talking about it, who's focused on it, and then figuring out how to actually do it. And then the last thing I'll say, Ruth, you want to really know how to do it as a school leader, call Andre Samuels in the district. He's a school leader. He had the highest percentage of Black male teachers of any school in the District of Columbia when he ran Brown Education Campus. So there's a cadre of people in the district who'd be willing to sit and work on this because it's part of their life's work.
Thank you. That's great. A lot of follow-up. Get ready to hear me. Oh, wait, I'm not on, am I? Oh, I am. Okay. All right. I said I was going to do one per person. I think next is Erin. So Erin, my question to you is, you talked about this issue around I guess it's the re-enrollment, the students who leave before and after count day. You talked a little bit about it, but how would you how would you alter our rating system based on this? I mean, Josh had one idea about you have two different sets of students. How would you use that information to alter the way we do the ratings, or would you? Whether it's re-enrollment or whatever.
I guess more than just re-enrollment, that's probably a very discrete and direct example of how mid-year mobility and year-to-year mobility is disproportionately impacting some schools. But we need to look through all of the metrics to think about how student mobility is intertwined with those metrics. It's not just re-enrollment. It's going to interact differently with attendance rates, with discipline, with a park. And folks talked about that a lot already. So I'd reiterate what they said. We have a misalignment between the subset of students that we use for funding purposes and the subset that we hold schools accountable for. Those are not aligned, and that's probably should not be the case. So I think enrollment, it's the most fundamental piece of our school report cards is which students are in which schools. And which students are schools accountable for. And if we're not getting that right, we have a problem.
Thank you. All right, my question to Josh Boots. Quickly, you talked about this idea of the best of, I think, that depending on the school or the student, I'm not quite clear, you're rating one thing or another thing? Did I say that?
Yeah, it was a best of growth or achievement. So like, it could be at the student level or it could be at the school level. Like, just if you scored more points on achievement, then you would get more points for achievement in this best of metric. If you score more points for growth, you would get more points for growth in that metric. Or it could be at the student level, where if a student is not proficient but shows really great growth, then that is what counts in that category. Or if a student is proficient, that's what counts in that category.
So that makes a lot of sense, in the sense that it would put a lot of priority on, if you're at a school that doesn't have high proficiency, you'd put a lot of attention on the growth piece. Am I understanding that correctly? You sort of keep the proficiency.
Yes, right. I think my concern with the growth piece has always been that it's only for grades 4 through 8 and in the future high school. What about growth in grades kindergarten, first, second, third grade?
I want to
And
talk
that's
about
why
that offline.
and that's why having the group of students that you've served 3 or more years is important.
Okay. John Paul, I'm gonna ask you this. I think we're at the end of the first round. I think John Paul was very generous with us on that first round. It wasn't necessarily 3 minutes per person. I do think there's some remaining questions, and so my suggestion would be that it's 7:30. We have 2 resolutions, that we go for a second round, but that we really limit people to 2 minutes. Does that sound right to people? Did someone like wave or nod or shake or do anything?
I just suggest that those people that kept to the 3 minutes should get a second round, and those that went vastly over should maybe get a question or comment in. People like Dr. Sutter at a disadvantage when she tried to really focus in on her time.
I actually, I allowed all members to go to at least 5 minutes. So I think that's all pretty even in terms of timing. But I will keep everyone to 2 minutes if we agreed. If members would also, who have raised their hands in the chat, if you want to put it down so that I know that we can start that process again, that would be helpful. Mr. O'Sullivan, do you have a question for the second round?
I don't have any more questions.
Thank you. Dr. Gasoi.
Thank you. Erin already answered the question I was going to ask. So this is for Josh. 2. One is just, you mentioned that it would be good to measure engagement and career. And I was just wondering if you have ideas about how that would look on our report card. And then the other is on the PMF, are there any measures there that we don't currently use that you think we should?
There are no measures on the PMF that with the exception of college enrollment, I believe is well, also, they also have growth in grades kindergarten through 2nd through NWA MAP, but that's not a state-sponsored assessment, so it couldn't be used across the city. But I think those are the only 2 metrics. In terms of career measures, I previously stated that I think identifying what are the credentials that a student could achieve, and then giving a percentage of students who achieved an industry credential prior to leaving high school, or a percent of students who either met the college ready threshold on the SAT or APIB, or achieved an industry credential before leaving school. And I already forgot. Oh, the engagement in a new distance learning era, it could be in-person attendance if we were allowed to have in-person school, or it could be how many times did they attend an asynchronous lesson, completed an assignment on their learning management system, completed a lesson on their blended learning platform. And really, we would probably have to look at many different ways over the next year to do it, but knowing that distance learning is probably a fundamental component of schooling moving forward, we could really define it better a year from now.
Do I have a little?
Unfortunately, you do not. Mr. Parker.
Thank you. 2 questions. Feel free to tackle either one. How do we address the tension between adjusting our standard, right now known as proficiency, from the pathways that students would have to pursue for college and careers? Many of them will have to take tests. And so if we're going to deem a school high quality, yet students are not meeting a certain standard, how do we address that tension? And then secondly, thinking through a technical adaptive framework. Right now, the technical is just setting up a metric or a system of evaluating school quality. What are some ways that we can focus on improving our schools? So if you all can quickly address that, I would appreciate it.
I'd just say that I really appreciate the work personally that you've been doing on standards. And I don't feel like if schools are properly supported and teachers are properly supported, I don't feel like there has to be that tension. between growth and staying, on grade level standards. So looking forward to seeing more there. But, to the extent we can provide teachers and schools with accurate, up-to-date information about where kids are and the supports they need, they should be accessing grade level content.
Ditto, my opinion, ditto what Erin just said. What we're trying to do at Empiric K-12 and supporting schools is looking at improvement science and continuous improvement interval training. Like, we want to be figuring out, like, what are our highest priorities and needs for every student individually. And then in a high intensity sort of interval training style, what can we do with them over the next 2 to 4 weeks to show progress in that area? And learn quick to fail fast is sort of our motto. Like, if it's not working, let's try something new and different, so that we're not spending a whole year failing. We're spending 2 to 4 weeks and then like learning, and it's okay. But setting that system up in a way that allows teachers to be, that it's okay to fail. That's how we learn. And so we have to set up that sort of system within our schools to be like, we tell students it's okay to fail as long as you learn from it, and we should be able to tell teachers it's okay to fail so long as you learn from it, but that failure needs to happen way more quickly than 1 year.
Zach, I think one piece is this idea of like what are the measures that we're using? And I'll just use high school, for example. Are we using the right measures in the report card to determine school quality at a high school? And in some states, they use the SAT, ACT. But yet in higher education, the SAT, ACT is actually optional. But yet people in K-12 will oftentimes say, well, that is an indicator of whether they're college ready. But that's not, clearly there's a disconnect between folks in higher ed and folks in K-12, right? Because you can get into UC Berkeley without a SAT, ACT score. UT Austin, like, you can get into large state universities that have amazing academic spaces. So I'm not suggesting that you don't use SAT, ACT. I think it's also about ensuring that we're measuring the right things to determine whether a student is successful, right? So if a student does well in literacy but doesn't do well in mathematics, does it mean student has been successful?
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. I appreciate that. Dr. Sutter.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. So my question is for whoever wants to answer it. We have talked also on the research committee about the purposes for with which people consume the star rating data. So the purpose of the state accountability system is to evaluate how schools are doing, and ideally to notify us of which schools need more support to improve. We also know that parents use it to make choices about schools, and that lots of other people use it to make judgments about schools. What's your take on how we should think about those multiple purposes as we consider any modifications to the system? Is there one purpose we should rate higher in our consideration of how to modify the system than another, or any other insights you might have on that?
So like I said earlier, that there's data for accountability, data for improvement, and within the data for accountability, there's data for ratings and data for reporting. I think there are additional data points that we've already talked about on this call that can and should be reported. But like the report card itself, and this is no offense to the OSSI team who's probably listening, it has a lot of information, but it's not easily sortable, which is why we created our own dashboard to help sort of like manage like the ability to customly sort things. So is there a potential for a tool for whatever parents are prioritizing for their students to be like, I'm prioritizing these 5 things in addition to like starting or not starting? They might not even prioritize that. Like, it's being comprehensive, but also allowing parents to get clear conclusions about how schools are doing for the things that matter for them.
Thank you. Members, are there additional questions? Sorry, Ms. Wattenberg?
I think Mr. Parker got up before me.
Oh, apologies, Mr. Parker.
I was just going to extend my question before, and I appreciate, Josh, you talking about like improvement as well as Erin. If you all can talk specifically about like how a state agency might work to support the improvement of schools versus merely just rating them.
I think that comes with Robert, your son. Hilarious. That comes with really looking at your comprehensive support schools and your what is the other term, like the specific student support schools, and it's what you require in those plans, and then how does the state spend funds to support what are in those plans. And so like for us, it's that continuous improvement piece. I know that's not the only piece that is relevant to improving schools, but like really helping teachers and educators figure out how can I analyze information in a quicker, better way and be okay with like, that didn't work, I need to try and pivot to something else.
I'd say, in addition to that, there's a lot of great examples up there, and a state education agency has the privilege of sitting at the top of the mountain, and they are the only ones who can see students moving across schools, moving across LEAs. We know that we have a high student mobility rate in DC, and right now we don't have anyone capturing those student trajectories over time. And it's not, schools alone can't do that work. LEAs alone can't do that work. So they need somebody feeding back to them. Here are the patterns of, what eighth graders who graduated in 2017 looked like as they moved on to various school settings. If we collected course data, this would really, really help. We could have an early warning system, much more common to other states, which uses attendance, behavior, and course data, ABCs, typically, and we don't do that yet. So there's a lot of data use aspects that we can feed back to LEAs so that they can better do their job. And then there's a lot of administrative data pieces that the SEA can do to provide LEAs with consistent administrative data that they need in a very timely, consistent way every year that they can count on to do basic functions in a more high quality way.
Thank you. Ms. Wattenberg.
Yeah, I want to follow up in a way on Mr. Parker's earlier comment, which is this tension between proficiency and growth. And I want to pose it slightly differently, which is this, that many people here in our previous meeting, people on the board themselves, many people have talked about how proficiency doesn't capture the quality of a school in the sense that so much of the proficiency level speaks to everything that happened to the student before they entered the school. And so speaking for myself, it seems like that doesn't, and I think Mr. Cuny had raised this, is that to rate below, for example, on proficiency when 90% of whether or not a student is proficient or not happened before doesn't seem fair. Yet, and this is to Mr. Parker's point, if you don't include a lot of weight on proficiency and instead you sort of reward people for growth, do students, do teachers, school people, administrators get the impression that therefore proficiency doesn't matter, it's not the goal, and therefore expectations fall? Is that a dilemma? I mean, how do you deal with that?
I think that is the right question. I think that is a dilemma, Ruth. I would also say from the parents that we've met in Ward 7 and 8 and across the city, that proficiency matters to all of them. Like, they have high expectations for their students, and that proficiency matters to them. I do agree with you about like when a student comes to a school multiple grade levels behind, is proficiency the right metric for impact for that first year? Like maybe, yes, proficiency within 3 to 5 years is the right metric for that student. So there are things that we can be looking about, like, is the universe of students that are included in the proficiency metric inclusive of students that are new to the school or not? So there are business rules that you can look at to maybe potentially redefine who is in the universe of proficiency.
Thank you. The representative's time has expired.
Can I just say to Dr. Simmons and Erin Roth that if they have answers to that question, I would be super interested.
Mr. Wattenberg, I do notice that Dr. O'Leary does have now a question. Dr. O'Leary?
As someone who taught in schools that would have been rated star rating schools for 47 years with a 1, and realized that the students left being much more proficient than when they got there, that's the dilemma, I think, for everyone. And that's what this unique opportunity that we have could really change the system completely. And I'd just like to get some feedback on that. Because the concept of proficient for a student who comes to your class and reads at a 5th grade level, and when they leave, they're senior in high school and they leave and they're reading at a 9th grade level, that's unbelievable. All right, but the system would look at them as a failure. And I just wonder what y'all have to say about how can we make the system equitable in its rating?
I would, that's a great question and kind of similar to yours, Ruth. And in advance of totally changing the system, which is not what I will offer, have insight on right now, but I will say that we can use the data that we have to get much closer than we are. If we are doing a good job of measuring student growth, it will reflect what you're talking about. Unfortunately, MGPs are not, don't provide as much information as just looking at student scale scores over time. Other states that we're part of, the PARC Consortium, used to do this. And we can do that too. Pearson provides us that data every year, and it's a much more, PARC, as students are being tested on grade level, if they are very far behind grade level, it is harder to capture that progress. It just is. However, their scale scores are the best way to do that we already have access to, and we're not doing it yet.
I would just like to, I disagree with Erin on that. I believe the SGPs are a valid and reliable measure. The scale scores on the PARC are not equal interval scale points. Going from a 750 to a 751 is not the same as going from a 650 to a 651. But also, to answer your question, Fraser, that's why I am advocating for a student group that is the students that a school has served for 3 or more years to be added to the STAR framework, to capture how are we doing with students that we've been able to serve for 3 or more years, and to be able to demonstrate to the public, like, when you stay at our school and you can be successful.
Thank you. President Wattenberg, I believe the discussion is completed.
I'm going to use my prerogative of the chair to do one thing, which is there was that last question that was asked ultimately by 3 people about the tension between proficiency and growth. Mr. Boots got to answer, Ms. Roth got to answer, and I would like to put it to Dr. Simmons before we end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of the articles that I sent over, this is a dilemma that folks have wrestled with, is this idea of proficiency. Folks in the educational equity space would argue that if you don't have proficiency, do people then have what Julie Landsman writes about in her Landmark article, the racism of low expectations, right? Like some people would argue that. Then you have people who are social scientists who would say growth measures are much more effective because you have to account for the dilemma of the social conditions that young people have to face, whether it's gentrification, whether it's a food desert, whether it's over-policing of certain communities and things like that. And that a growth measure allows for schools to be measured in a way that accounts for things outside of their control. So it's a eternal debate. I'll let Erin and Josh have that out after the call. I'm happy to listen But again, I'm a social scientist, and I enjoy the rigorous debate of those who are in the measurement space. But for folks who are social scientists, you know, we believe that there are all sorts of other factors that play into this. To Dr. O'Leary's point, that when a kid shows up and they haven't eaten, and then you wonder why they step out of your class at, I don't know, whatever time it is, and then you get dinged by said government agency for in-seat attendance because said student is not there. Well, they're not there because they didn't eat. So, like, how do you account for that as a school when it comes to some of these measures that don't allow for life? Right. Amidst a system that has disenfranchised certain groups of people. But Ruth, the two pieces that I shared kind of get at that and this dilemma. And again, I will say that I'm a growth person, not a proficiency person. That's just my own preference from when I was a teacher. But I started teaching in the era where there was no debate and no discussion. It was simply proficiency or bust. Like there was nothing. So I think the field has evolved. And I think Erin and Josh are well positioned. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I can't go to a hockey game with Josh again. But I will say that I think that the city is in good hands because Erin and Josh are both around to have this rigorous debate and figure out a solution.
All right. On that, I want to say I agree with your estimation of Josh and Erin and their contributions, and I would extend that to you as well. And I also want to extend it to my colleagues who I think are really trying to grapple with what is this incredibly difficult issue, and with a lot of open minds and diligence. So we shall persevere. Anyway, this was terrific. I'm a bit of a wonk, but I think I'm speaking for everybody to say this was really, really a terrific discussion. And as it turned out, it was terrific to have three of you so we could go several rounds. I expect to follow up with each of you. So be ready, and we'll also make sure we've read everything before we do that. But thank you very, very, very much.
Hear, hear.
All right. All right. To the members who are staying, to the members who are here. All right, we're going to consider 4 resolutions. First is CR 20-8. Is that right, that we're doing the, we're not doing the ceremonials first, John Paul?
That is the ceremonial.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I mixed it up with teacher retention. Sorry. We're going to consider CR 20-8, teacher and principal appreciation. Is there a motion on the resolution?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Having been properly moved and seconded, the resolution will be read into the record. Mr. Hayworth, please read the resolution.
State Board of Education ceremonial resolution honoring the impact of teachers and principals in the district, CR 20-8. Whereas National Teacher Appreciation Week was held May 4th through the 8th, 2020, and National Teacher Day was recognized on May 5th, 2020. Whereas teachers help students acquire knowledge, competence, and virtue on numerous subjects and topics. Whereas student success in the District of Columbia is nurtured in the classroom by teachers who instill a lifelong love of learning, and through the school building by principals who set the stage for success. Whereas teachers serve multiple roles in their classroom, including that of role model, caregiver, coach, listening ear, encourager, and mentor who help shape the lives of students. Whereas as a society, we recognize the irreplaceable role that teachers and principals play in facilitating knowledge, passion, imagination, confidence, and leadership in all of our young people. Whereas principals and other school leaders provide vital support to a school community which is essential for a school to be successful. And whereas teachers and principals have gone above and beyond their call of duty during the COVID-19 pandemic by striving to adapt their instruction to meet the unique needs of their students and to support their students through constant communications and encouragement. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education honors all teachers and principals in the District of Columbia for their invaluable work educating our young people, developing their character, all students, parents, and families.
Thank you. Is there discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Hayworth will call the roll.
Dr. Gasoi,
I approve.
Mr. Jacobson, Mr. Jacobson, Dr. O'Leary,
I approve.
Mr. Parker,
I approve.
Dr. Sutter,
I approve.
Ms. Williams,
I approve.
Mr. Batchelor,
Where are y'all getting this from?
Ms. Macleay,
I forgot what to say, so I started. You don't have
I guess we're all going to approve.
Mr. O'Sullivan,
Approve.
Ms. Burton, President Wattenberg.
Aye.
Madam President, the motion is approved.
Thank you. Our next resolution is CR 20-9, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Ms. Sutter, would you like to make the motion on the resolution?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Having been properly moved and seconded, the resolution will be read into the record. Mr. Hayworth, would you read the resolution?
State Board Ceremonial Resolution recognizing Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, CR 20-9. Whereas Asian American Pacific Islander AAPI Heritage Month spans from May 1st to May 31st. Whereas AAPI Heritage Month originated with the United States Congress in 1977, when Representatives Frank Horton of New York and Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii introduced resolutions to proclaim the first 10 days in May as Pacific Asian American Heritage Week. Whereas on October 5th, 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a joint resolution directing presidents to issue a proclamation for the 7-day period beginning on May 4th, 1979 as Asian Pacific American Heritage Week. Whereas in 1992, the United States Congress passed legislation which annually designated May as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Whereas the month of May was chosen to commemorate the arrival of the first Japanese immigrant to the United States on May 7th, 1843, and to mark the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869, of which the majority of workers who laid the tracks were Chinese immigrants. And whereas AAPI Heritage Month recognizes and honors the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who have paved the way for AAPI visibility and are pushing our society forward today, influencing the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education recognizes May as Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and the more than 28,000 residents in the district who self-identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander.
Is there discussion on the resolution?
Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. I appreciate that our board takes the time to commemorate these months that honor the diversity of America. And I think it's especially helpful as we contemplate how to increase the number of voices and the perspectives from which we talk about history, politics, et cetera, in our social studies standards. So I'm very glad that we've taken the time to bring forth this resolution. I look forward to supporting it.
I'd like to make a suggestion that we raise our hands to vote.
Okay.
Unfortunately, Dr. O'Leary, we have to do roll call votes in virtual form.
Okay.
Ms. Wattenberg?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this follows procedure, so you can advise me, but it seems to me there ought to be something in that resolution that acknowledges the terrible attacks that are being made on Asian Americans as we speak across the country. And I wonder if we have general agreement on that, if there's a way to add a sentence or a whereas on that after this meeting, and then maybe we could do a vote by phone call or email, because it does seem to me that would be very appropriate, and it would not be so appropriate not to.
So am I hearing you correctly, Ms. Wattenberg, that your motion is to add a clause related to the violence experienced by Asian Americans during the current COVID public health crisis?
Yes.
Is that
I haven't written it, so it would have to be written after the fact, or I guess someone could write it right now, but that we do it by phone afterwards.
So first, we would need a second on the motion, on the amendment motion, unless it is accepted as friendly by the maker of the motion in the second.
I have a question.
Dr. O'Leary?
I don't think that, I understand why you brought that up, but I don't think that's a good idea. Because then you're, that's not why we brought it up. That's not why the amendment was started. That's not why the amendment was changed. I mean, when you went through that long list of alterations in the week to a month and everything like that, it was to celebrate the Asian and Pacific Islanders, and I don't think that we should add that. I understand the concept that you're talking about, Ruth, but I don't think that should be part of the resolution. That's just my opinion.
Dr. Sutter?
I'm inclined to agree with Dr. O'Leary, and I appreciate that Ms. Wattenberg brought up the fact that the attacks against Asian Americans, I'm sorry, have happened at this time, but I agree with Dr. O'Leary that I think the purpose of the resolution is to celebrate contributions, and I would hesitate to add this in there.
Is there additional discussion?
I would just like to say I agree with Dr. Sutter and Mr. President. I don't think that bring up the violence.
If that's the consensus, I will pull it back. I understand.
Okay. The motion has been withdrawn. The motion is on approval of CR 20-9. Is there additional discussion? Seeing none, Madam President, would you like to move to the roll call?
Yes, please.
Dr. Gasoi.
Aye.
Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Jacobson. Dr. O'Leary.
Aye.
Mr. Parker.
Aye.
Dr. Sutter.
Aye.
Ms. Williams. Ms. Williams.
Okay, aye.
Mr. Batchelor.
Aye.
Ms. Macleay.
Aye.
Ms. Burton. Ms. Burton. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
President Wattenberg.
Aye.
Madam President, the motion is approved.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Actually, no, now I'm not anymore, so never mind. Are other people? Is everybody okay now? Okay. Our next resolution is SR 20-7, supporting schools with teacher retention. Dr. O'Leary, would you like to make the motion?
I have an amendment that I'd like to add.
So I think we move it, we second it, and then we'll take the amendments.
Okay. I'd like to move to accept the resolution as
Okay.
amended.
Second.
Second.
Okay. Having been properly moved and seconded, Mr. Hayworth, could you read the resolution?
State Board of Education resolution on supporting teacher retention in our schools, SR 20-7. Whereas since May 2018, the DC State Board of Education has prioritized the issue of teacher retention and understanding the effects that low rates of retention have on district students, schools, and communities. Whereas in October 2018, the State Board released its first commission report on teacher retention in the District of Columbia, which found that the average annual school-level teacher retention rate in both DC public schools and public charter schools is 75%, compared to a national average of 84%. Whereas the State Board's subsequent and updated October 29 report highlighted the same low rates of teacher retention in the district and that the rate of teacher departure rises with the percentage of students considered at risk, and schools with the highest percentages lose almost a third of their teachers each year. Whereas in March 2020, the state board released the results of a survey conducted by an independent researcher of teachers who departed DCPS and public charter schools in school years 2017 through 2019, which illustrated that the main reasons teachers departed were unfairness of teacher evaluation systems, work culture and workload, teacher safety and mental health, and tensions with school leaders. Whereas the March 2020 survey results also found 66% of respondents voluntarily resigned or quit, with most of the other respondents indicated that they were terminated, left due to downsizing, on temporary contracts, or retired. 80% stated all or most of their students were at risk and or low income, and 86% were passionate about teaching, but felt they had not received adequate support from their school or their LEA. Whereas research, sorry, I just hit the button wrong. Whereas research shows that teaching longevity is positively associated with student achievement gains throughout a teacher's career, and that a teacher's effectiveness increases at a greater rate when they teach in a supportive and collegial working environment. Whereas research demonstrates that teacher replacement costs, including expenses related to separation, recruitment, hiring, and training, can be more than $20,000 per teacher in urban districts, dollars that can be spent on teacher mentoring and learning opportunities. Whereas research illustrates that teacher retention has been tied to improving or maintaining effective school climate due to teachers' institutional knowledge about students, the school's curricula and programs, while preventing learning loss during the school year. And whereas several multi-year studies have shown that racial diversity in the teaching field helps all students succeed and increases performance and graduation rates for students of color. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education calls on the Council of the District of Columbia to adopt the statewide Educational Data Warehouse Amendment Act of 2019 to ensure that data relevant to understanding the nature of teacher retention across the district's public schools are available annually and publicly. Be it further resolved that the State Board calls on district LEAs to review their teacher evaluation systems and frameworks to assure high-quality teaching in all district schools, such that the teacher evaluation systems lead to targeted professional development for teachers, all to address the issues of subjectivity and inconsistency, as well as concerns with evaluator experience and knowledge as raised by teachers. Be it further resolved that the State Board ask the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to consider implementing a statewide professional development and mentoring program directed towards effective teachers with under 5 years of experience to assist them in the transition in this all-important stage of their careers. Be it further resolved, the State Board asks the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to consider implementing a statewide professional development program training school-level leadership, as the State Board survey results found that the school leadership was routinely cited as the biggest driver of teachers' experiences. And be it finally resolved that the State Board asks the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to proactively work to remove barriers to the effective recruitment and retention of teachers of color, especially Black and Latino candidates.
Is there discussion on the resolution? I think that Mr. O'Leary has an amendment.
I have an amendment to lines 60 through 63. Be it further resolved, the State Board asks the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to consider implementing a statewide professional development and mentoring program directed towards teachers with under 5 years of experience and incorporating differentiated professional development that targets the specific needs and growth points of the individual teacher and allows them to learn and observe from the experts in their field. And I'd like to amend those lines.
Second.
It this on my.
Sorry, I'm getting there. I apologize. Okay.
Are we supposed to weigh in now, or?
Yeah.
So if the amendment is friendly, which means that Dr. O'Leary and Dr. Gasoi would agree that this is a friendly amendment, it would be automatically included if there's not objection.
And then we can take further discussion and further amendments, but it would be part of the main motion.
Dr. O'Leary, I'm sorry. Can you read that again?
Sure. Be it further resolved, the State Board asks the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to consider implementing a statewide professional development and mentoring program directed towards teachers with under 5 years of experience and incorporating differentiated professional development that targets the specific needs and growth points of the individual teacher and allows them to learn and observe from the experts in their field.
And if I can ask a question, is the understanding of that change that we're expecting OSSI to do that for teachers under 5 years? Or that schools are doing that for teachers?
We're asking OSSI to set it up.
Got it.
But it also widens what schools can do to help those new teachers. That's why it was added.
Can I say, I no longer have my gallery, so John Paul, I hope you do, because I can't call on anybody.
Can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Karen.
Go ahead, Karen.
Does OSSI have the staff or the ability to do that? To do professional development with all teachers under 5 years? Not that it's a bad ask, I'm just asking if it's possible.
We know that it's a different ask, but it's something that it was triggered by the teacher retention committee and the survey, and it's not currently being done by anybody.
So if we put that in there and OSSI then comes back and says that I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm trying to figure out if it's a practical idea.
I think it is an extraordinarily practical idea. We'll see what happens with it. But it's got, that's the whole big problem with a lot of these teachers that left before 5 years, was they weren't feeling like they were supported. And the professional development wasn't productive. Much more punitive than it was helpful.
I'm not sure if we can all jump in here. I think I'm with.
Sorry.
Is it okay to weigh in or ask a clarifying question?
Yes, I did have other members that had questions, and it is challenging to see. So go ahead.
I'm just going to ask. I appreciate Karen's question, and it's along the lines of what I was grappling with. Like, is this even realistic? Is this a nice to have, or is this something we really expect to happen? And my question is, do we know of other states where they have mandated mentoring programs, or where they are managing it? Or so that's one part. Or Frazier, would it be that OSSI is providing guidance to schools to do this, or LEAs rather, to do this? Would that be sufficient?
That's what I would hope would happen. But yes, the answer to your first question is yes. There are states that are doing that.
Got it.
And very, very successfully. But the push has to happen from us.
So just to make sure I'm super clear, so you would be satisfied with OSSI providing guidance to LEAs around a mentorship program, not so much that OSSI is managing a statewide mentorship program.
It's not just mentorship, Zach. It's professional development too. It's my going to someone's class who's a veteran teacher and learning from them how to do it. So it's not just mentorship where you and I have a conversation. It's being able to watch what other people do, watch videos. It's being able to keep a program set up.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. So as it was written before the amendment, I understood the ask to be that OSSI would consider implementing statewide professional development and mentoring program targeted at these early career teachers. I think that left a lot of room for OSSI to determine its capacity to do that, how it might design one, whether it did so with giving guidance to LEAs or creating a statewide teacher induction program, which I know I've seen in other states. I worry that as amended, while I know it is responding to some feedback we got from teachers, I think it asks of OSSI something that OSSI has not done before, and would be very difficult in the context of our city's system of education, our state system of education, where we have 67 school districts, each of which, or 63 school districts, each of which has specific autonomies over the training, induction, professional development for educators. So I would happily vote for the resolution in its original format, but have significant concerns with the amended language.
John Paul?
Ms. Macleay.
Along those lines, I want to agree with Dr. Sutter. In my earlier email today, like in the fact that the Board of Ed does not actually set curriculum, we set curriculum standards. In the same respect, I would not expect for us to actually implement this program or tell OSSI what to do and how to create this program. We can call on them and ask them to create a professional development and mentoring program, but how they go about best doing that would be on OSSI. I don't see that us advising them on specifics is appropriate or what this board should be doing. Additionally, I do want to say, while I am in support of professional development and mentoring, not just for our younger teachers, I love the fact that we want to include mentoring and professional development for all teachers, as well as school leadership. I've been pushing for principal mentoring and professional development in my current and entire tenure on this board.
Okay, that's under line 65.
I would, but I would not support this current. I would not support this with the amendment. I would support it in as currently read, pre-amendment.
Thank you. Is there additional discussion on the amendment? Dr. Gasoi.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I think Ashley was referring to my email earlier.
Dr. Gasoi, can everyone mute, please, other than Dr. Gasoi? Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Gasoi.
So my suggestion in the email was that we actually not vote on this tonight, because I think, what the issues raised by the teachers, I think are valid, and I think we should continue to discuss this. And I think that's further evidenced in our conversation right now. So my suggestion is that we actually don't vote on this tonight.
Thank you. Ms. Wattenberg.
So I was going to propose an amendment that would be a little, to amend this a little bit so that it spoke to what I do think is Fraser's main idea, which is to promote the idea of mentoring because it is so effective. So something that would be more along the lines of sort of words like to ask OSSI to consider how to promote, support, and incentivize the development of mentoring programs. So that's what I was going to propose. It's looser. It gives OSSI some room. It also gives LEAs and schools some rooms, but it's clear on the goal, which is teachers need mentors. So I was going to propose that, but I also am sympathetic as well to Emily's idea that we should delay it till next time. So I could go either way, depending on where other people want to go.
So just to make sure that I'm clear on.
Wait, and I want to ask one question, which is to Fraser as to whether or to there's a reason why it must pass tonight as opposed to in June. Because I would say if we can delay it till June and get it right, that seems preferable. But I don't know if there's a timeline that is in your mind.
The budget hearings.
Yeah.
That was I mean, I agree sort of both ways. I mean, I appreciate what everybody said about it. I don't have a problem with the changing the language. I don't have a problem with throwing it out to everybody and have you send me your stuff like we did last time, because you did a great job of sending the information on the teacher retention on this resolution itself. I don't know. I just think, I mean, I don't want to not have it because I think it's very important, but I'm open to wait till the June meeting and to talk about and Ashley, to talk about both of those from 60 to 68, which are the teacher and the principals stuff. You know, I'd like to just, if we could just look at those lines between 60 and 68 and see if we can come to, and I don't mind, you know, setting a deadline and then sending it back to everybody and see how you like the way it looks. That's fine with me.
So just to make sure that I'm following, sorry, Ruth. So the maker of the motion has said that he would consider withdrawing. So I just want to make sure that is what the maker of the motion wants to do. So Dr. O'Leary, are you withdrawing this resolution?
Yes, for the time being.
Okay, the motion has been withdrawn.
Okay. Thank you to everybody for that discussion. And let me just note one thing in terms of the budget coming up. Insofar as the goal is to have some state board support for the idea of mentorship programs, that is actually in the resolution that we adopted in January, February around the retention report. It doesn't have the broader set of issues, but that is in there. So just FYI. So I appreciate the willingness to sort of take a look at this and bring it back in June. All right. The next discussion is our final resolution is SR 20-8, supporting students with disabilities. Mr. Parker, would you like to make the motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Moved and seconded. The resolution will be read into the record. Mr. Hayward, please read the resolution.
State Board of Education resolution on supporting students with disabilities, SR 20-8. Whereas the current COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted learning for the District of Columbia's roughly 90,000 students. Whereas the Office of the State Superintendent of Education has committed in its 2019-2023 strategic plan to helping accelerate academic outcomes for students with disabilities. Whereas outcomes for students with disabilities lag behind their peers. Whereas 2 out of every 20 students with disabilities, 1 out of every 20 students with primary disability or specific learning disability, and 1 out of every 20 students with disabilities who are at risk are classified as proficient in literacy on the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, the district's statewide English Language Arts assessment. Whereas from 2016 to 2019, the percentage of students without disabilities who performed on grade level increased by 14 percentage points, while students with disabilities increased by only 3 percentage points on the ELA statewide assessment. Whereas poverty and race are linked to the identification and exit of students with disabilities, and 1 out of 4 Black males and 1 out of 8 Black females are identified as students with disabilities, twice the rate of their white peers, and Black students are less likely to exit special education services once identified, even after controlling for other demographic factors. Whereas other urban districts, including Miami-Dade, Boston, New York City, San Diego, demonstrate that better outcomes for students with disabilities are possible. Whereas research indicates that nearly all students with disabilities can perform on grade level, 85% to 90% of students with disabilities can perform at grade level when provided with appropriate services and supports. Whereas OSSI is committed to improving outcomes for students with disabilities by building ecosystem capacity, which among other things includes exploring a technical assistance center to share resources. Whereas in 2018, the Office of the Student Advocate developed a family engagement framework that can be leveraged to better support parents of students with disabilities. Whereas during this period of school closures due to COVID-19, families of students with disabilities, as well as special education advocates and scholars, have testified before the state board that 1, it has been difficult to find critical information, including contact information for school-based personnel able to answer special education related questions during school closures. Not all take-home packets have been modified for students with disabilities. And school distance learning plans have remained unavailable to families. And the frequently asked questions guidance on OSSI's website should provide more necessary information to assist families attempting to support their children's learning at home. And whereas the state board wants to partner with OSSI to advance the critical priority of improving outcomes for students with disabilities, now therefore be it resolved to facilitate families' communication with their schools about issues related to educating students with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic, the state board calls on OSSI to make available on their website contact information for school-based special education liaisons and personnel and school distance learning plans, particularly any special education provisions for each DC public school. Be it further resolved that the state board calls on OSSI to prompt local education agencies to provide enrollment flexibility for students with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic, to clarify and deepen guidance on nursing staff requirements for LEAs during the COVID-19 pandemic should school buildings open in the fall, to clarify guidance for how LEAs should provide modifications for students with disabilities, both through the visual learning and take-home materials, to update its FAQ document with critical information OSSI sought and received, and the state board shall provide quarterly updates to OSSI about requests, questions, and complaints we received from families during the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Parker, I believe you have an amendment, correct?
Yes, I do. Well, before I do that, I just want to quickly frame this, being that we all know that the ongoing pandemic has wreaked havoc on our schools. It has compromised student learning, and it has exacerbated inequities that exist in our schools and in our system. And one area in particular where our attention should be is on our vulnerable students during this time. I appreciate that OSSI has made a central focus in a strategic plan our students with disabilities, and I'm proud that the state board is now focusing in on this area during this pandemic. And so during the time us hearing from advocates at our working session to now, I've had opportunity to interface with parents, representatives at the charter board, representatives at DCPS, and even at OSSI. And what I've heard loud and clear is that there is a lot more that OSSI can do and that we all can do to ensure that we're providing our students with disabilities a high quality education, even during this pandemic. And so with that, I just want to say how proud I am that we as a board are taking up this resolution and shining a light on this very important area. With that said, I did share via email several friendly amendments that I received. And so I will read them one by one. John Paul, you do have them. And there is one slight change that we've already discussed. And so that first amendment is that on line 58 in the resolution, we would insert the following after the word school. Quote, and, comma, beginning in December 2020, comma, ensure that the information be included on the DC report card. And so the sentiment there is that we are asking for OSSI to make public school distance learning plans, as well as school-based contacts for special education liaisons. And we also want this information to be included on the the DC report card. And so that is the spirit of that. And I would just also say, we know that parents' first line of communication is going to be their school, and it should be the school. We are not in any way suggesting that OSSI should be parents' first go-to location. That said, as was previously mentioned, being that we have 63 LEAs and counting, if I am a parent that has a kid that goes to a DCPS school and perhaps 2 charter schools, and all of those schools are following different guidelines for how they share information and post information, we should, as a state, have one central location where parents can go to know that they can find this critical information. The second friendly amendment is on line 62 to insert the following after the word pandemic and before what is currently listed as to clarify and deepen guidance, etc. So on line 62, we would insert, quote, to provide guidance to LEAs on parent training as a related service pursuant to Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And so in my conversations with parents, some connected with PAVES, others in area Ward 5 schools, I've heard loud and clear that we should call on OSSI to expand and commit to training parents regarding their rights, as well as what they can do and expect during this ongoing pandemic. I would also just note, I did circle back with the advocates that share with us at our working session, and they too highlighted the need to increase parent training during this time. The third friendly amendment that I received that I am entertaining on line 60 through 62, inserting the following after be it further resolved. And it would replace what is currently there that starts with the state board calls on OSSI, et cetera, that first clause. So on line 60 to 62, it would read now, the state board calls on OSSI to extend IDEA eligibility to students who would otherwise lose eligibility at the end of the 2019-2020 school year. In the current framing of the language of the resolution, the spirit is staying the same. We're just being more specific. And so right now, or the original wording says to provide guidance to LEAs on enrollment flexibility, I believe. And now what we're saying is that we are calling on OSSI to specifically extend IDEA eligibility to students who would otherwise lose that eligibility at the end of the 2019-2020 school year. Just a little bit further context, as we know, DCPS, for instance, has said on May 29th, all of its schools will close. There are a number of students who would therefore lose by right of law the services that they are currently guaranteed through IDEA, and we're calling on OSSI to extend those services for a time that they designate as appropriate based on feedback, hopefully that they receive from LEAs and parents, so that students can receive more services through the summer leading into the fall. And then the last very minor amendment was just to remove on line 66 the phrase "see attachment." So it's in parentheses. We would take that out of the resolution on line 66. I know my colleague, Dr. Sutter, also wanted to propose friendly amendments. I'm not sure if now is the time.
No, Mr. Parker, it is not. So the maker of the motion has made a friendly amendment. Does the second agree? Dr. O'Leary, that would be you. Yes?
You muted me. Yes.
Yes. Is there objection to the amendments as stated by Mr. Parker? Then the amendments are accepted. Are there additional amendments or discussion? Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Parker. First, I want to start with thank you for bringing this forth. I think that the topic of how we serve our students with disabilities in the city, how we meet the needs of their families, how we make sure that adequate and appropriate information is available to families in an easy to access place. However, I have some concerns about the resolution, and I want to offer a request. And if that request is not entertained, then I have one friendly amendment. I reached out to several additional special education advocates and folks with an interest in this work. So I reached out to school leaders in Ward 6 who have schools with significant populations of students with special ed needs. I reached out to national experts on special education who are aligned with the Educating All Learners initiative, which is an online effort trying to help schools meet the needs of students with disabilities in this unique time, trying to source the best information from around the country. And I reached out to other advocates who were not in the meeting that we held as a working session, folks who are appreciative of the Special Education Advocacy Coalition, but are not members per se. I did hear back from a number of folks. One of them offered clear language on the friendly amendment I would offer, but others suggested that there's still a lot we do not know. We are about to hear from the mayor about what summer is going to bring. We're about to hear some entertained notions of how LEAs are planning for the next school year, which may alter some of the things we want to ask OSSE to provide guidance on, or which may in fact prove some of this null and void in its currently written format. And I would use the example of deepen guidance on nursing staff requirements for LEAs, because if we do not go back to in-person school for a time period, or the way we go back to in-person school looks significantly different, we may want to ask for more than just that in-person guidance. I apologize to have to do this. My oven is now beeping. I have to stop it. Okay, nobody wanted to hear that for the rest of my comment. So given that, there were a few suggestions folks made to say, could you consider waiting a little while until the picture of next year became clearer and introduce a resolution that had even more specific recommendations for additional things that may not be contemplated in this one. So for instance, we don't talk in here at all about compensatory education. Part of that is we still don't have enough answers on how much summer we're going to have or whether the public health restrictions will be lifted. And so whether any in-person services that were not delivered could be delivered. So that might be an opportunity to add that in. So I would say that aside from that last piece you mentioned, is this notion of students not getting to continue with services, none of this seems super time sensitive for the next 2 weeks. And so I would wonder if it's possible to postpone this until June when we have more details on what the next school year might look like, what summer might look like. If that is not the case, I have a simple friendly amendment that John Paul has to offer.
Do you want to share the friendly amendment now?
Sure. John Paul, I can read it from my screen if you can show it on yours.
I think it is.
Oh, is it?
Is it not?
Yep, sorry, clearly I need reading glasses. It would be on line 65, inserting provide guidance to LEAs on data tracking of virtual special education service provision and student progress monitoring that is available and transparent to students and families. And that would come before to update its FAQ documents.
I just chatted out, but I love that addition. And I think that is getting to something per your comments that is very top of mind for parents. It's like distance learning and virtual education now during the pandemic. My only hesitation with postponing passing the resolution, well, I would say two things. One is I very much would rather the board be in the place of leading on this issue versus seeing what happens, listening what comes out of the reopen groups, and then kind of responding or acting. And then two, as what I've heard from parents, including some that I spoke to just this morning, is that some children are not receiving modifications to take-home packets. Some children are not receiving take-home packets at all. For instance, those children who are in the midst of evaluations, schools are giving the excuse that they can't give take-home packets because they don't have the appropriate work for those students. Some parents are calling our sister offices with complaints. Our sister offices are having a trying time getting a hold of information. It is my understanding that, and which was reason for me reaching out to the charter board and DCPS this week. And so my only hesitation with waiting, my second hesitation would be that parents are voicing that this is a major concern now. And in my conversations with OSSI this week, and I would like to go on record and say it was a disappointment that I did not get in-depth feedback on the resolution, although we did discuss the sentiments of it. And what I heard from OSSI is, well, the law is the law and LEAs should be following the law. And while we know that is true, we also have data to tell us that that is not happening. And so instead of us watching that be the case, as children, our students with disabilities are failed by our schools with the best of intentions, and I know teachers and schools and principals are working tirelessly during this time, I think we have a sense of, we should act with a sense of urgency. And I hope that you would support passing the resolution with this friendly amendment, which I would be happy to include because I think it speaks to a missing component in the language.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, Zachary, is just that I think that your point is well taken, that there are school students that are not getting modifications. There are schools that are not providing work to students because they are saying we're in the midst of this evaluation process. I think my pushback would be part of that is there is a real lack of legal clarity around the federal law and what it mandates for school districts as LEAs for purposes of IDEA, and what the guidance schools are receiving on how to meet those requirements despite imperfect conditions. And I don't think our resolution will fix that problem. So I agree with your sense of urgency, but I do not think that our resolution solves the issue or will change the situation parents are facing, because I think that is an IDEA guidance concern. And again, that's feedback I got from advocates who said to me, there's so much uncertain here. Is there a rush?
No, thank you for that. I think that point is well taken. And I would say I still stand to put forth the resolution tonight, and I hope that we'll take a vote on it. And I welcome us coming back to this. In fact, I've spoken to Madam President about this being a reoccurring topic that we revisit monthly, as we have in previous months on teacher retention. I've also spoken to those in the executive, and they voiced to me that they would be happy to join us to discuss some of the services provided, but also how we might be able to preempt the identification of our students being labeled with disabilities. And so I hear you, I recognize it, and I do appreciate that feedback, and think we can also come back next month with a second resolution.
So to clarify the motion currently is Dr. Sutter has offered an amendment and has asked for it to be considered as friendly. Mr. Parker, do you accept it as friendly?
Yes, as written, as I'm looking at it on the screen, yes.
Dr. O'Leary, do you accept it as friendly?
Yes, I do.
Is there objection? The amendment is accepted as friendly. If members will give me about 2 minutes, I'll put the full text of the amendments together. But I believe Ms. Wattenberg has comments. If others have comments, please give me 2 minutes. Ms. Wattenberg, go ahead. You're on mute. Ruth, you're on mute.
She's not talking.
No. My mute button disappeared, and it has amazingly and miraculously reappeared. And you're all very big, but okay. All I wanted to say, I mean, what we just worked up is perfect for me. The one thing I wanted to add, and Zach has sort of said it, is I think all the, Jessica's point, these things are going to change. There's going to be more. We're going to learn more. All true. And what I was going to say is, so let's come back and do it. None of these things are going to go away. They're all important, and they're important now, and they feel very urgent and are very urgent to the people dealing with them. But there will be more. And so let's come back. So, I love the amendment.
Is there additional discussion?
I'll just say I'll be voting in favor of the resolution and appreciate my workout colleagues' constant attention on our most vulnerable students and families. And it's super important now more than ever. And the more we can voice what's happening on the ground, I think the better these discussions about how we effectively reopen and fill those gaps will be. And so I appreciate us raising our voice today and look forward to continued discussion on the subject.
Is there additional discussion?
Okay, seeing none, I believe. All those, and so it's just the motion, right? All those in favor of the motion?
Madam President, I apologize. We do need to do a roll call vote.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Gasoi,
Aye.
Mr. Jacobson, Mr. Jacobson, President Wattenberg,
Aye.
Dr. O'Leary,
Aye.
Mr. Parker,
Aye.
Dr. Sutter,
Sorry. Aye.
Ms. Williams, Ms. Williams,
She's there.
She's muted.
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Batchelor,
Aye.
Ms. Macleay,
Aye.
Ms. Burton, Mr. O'Sullivan.
Aye.
Madam President, the motion passes, and I believe your camera has fallen.
And you're muted.
What I said is I wasn't going to try to explain what I'm trying to accomplish, but anyway. Okay, so the resolution is approved. Members, are there any items of new business or announcements? I see Ms. Sutter.
I simply want to use a moment to congratulate our student member, Mr. O'Sullivan, who told me earlier via the chat that he has completed all of his 2020 AP exams, and I think he deserves a round of applause.
Woo!
Congratulations, Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you.
Congrats.
And while we're talking about him, I want to say one thing about the student committee that I went to last week. I reported on it a bit at the working session, but I just want to say to you, Alex, I have had so many conversations with so many people where I've talked about that discussion and the experiences that all the committee members had with the distance learning. It was so interesting. So thank you for having me and being so interesting.
Yeah, no problem. And we plan on incorporating some of our thoughts and suggestions on distance learning for our report that we should get to you next month for the public.
Excellent. We're looking forward to it.
As long as you're on the spot, Alex, I just want to put a plug in for more students to complete the well-rounded education survey that we sent you guys. So I think we've gotten several, but we could get more. And the student council's voice is really important here. So hope you'll encourage your peers to fill that out. Thank you and congratulations.
Madam President, if I could also plug the Student Advisory Committee application that is also live as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll just say to all of us that we should shoot it out more. Is that right, John Paul? We should be tweeting it out over this next period. Okay, along with the social studies application. Okay. Okay, so is that it with new business or announcements? We're done? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you all.